Chapter 276. The battle was in full swing. On the smoke-filled battlefield, the dead undead and the living half-demon monsters were entangled together, enduring the torment of the flames together. Do we have to do this? His sickly eyes glowed with a murderous green light. Like a devout believer, OBEO crossed his arms in front of his chest and muttered to himself in a persuasive tone. We have to do this. As he made up his mind, the worm armor on his body instantly sank into his body. At the same time, his entire body began to twist in an extremely abnormal posture. After about 2 to 3 breaths of time, a huge worm covered in scales appeared on the spot. It raised its head and looked at the battlefield in front of it. The 3 pairs of compound eyes on its head blinked and locked onto its target. The scaled worm immediately bent its body and touched the ground with its head. Using the bone armor near its mouth as a shovel, it burrowed deep into the soft soil of the sandbar like a giant earthworm and crawled underground. Watch your feet. Behind the trench and the low wall, Commander Wenfeng shouted loudly to remind the warriors who were sharpening their swords. He had been holding a monocular and nervously observing the entire battlefield. Naturally, he also noticed the abnormal movements of the enemy leader. However, just like when people have a sense of crisis, the danger has already quietly arrived. Before Commander Wenfeng's voice trailed off, and before the warriors could react, the ground under their feet began to tremble. Accompanied by the crashing sound of earth and rocks collapsing, a dark hole appeared behind the defense line. This guy's scales are really hard. The chief of the Fire Dwarf clan could not help but feel a little dumbfounded when he saw that his enchanted weapon had only left a white mark on the head of the monster that had crawled out of the hole. I swear that I used at least half of my strength just now, or even 2/3 of my strength. Otherwise, I would be a dwarf with a long beard. Commander Wenfeng had no intention of questioning his old friend. He pulled up his robe and tightly wrapped it around his mouth and nose. As if enraged by the flying cross, the scaled worm that OBEO had transformed and shook its head and began to spray saliva everywhere. Be careful, the experienced commander on duty reminded. He hurriedly reached out and grabbed the collars of 2 warriors who were too close to the hole and pulled them back. Trust me, you don't want to be stained by that thing. The commander on duty reacted quickly, but he was still 1 step too late. One of the warriors under his command was splashed in the face by the scaled worm's saliva. He immediately covered his eyes in pain. Green smoke rose from between his fingers with a hissing sound. With his case in front of them, everyone became alert and consciously retreated from the vicinity of the hole. I'm sorry. The scaly worm became excited at the success of its attack. Suddenly, the saliva in its mouth, which contained strong acid, formed a dense rain of strong acid arrows and sprayed in all directions. Magus's furnace above, the chief of the Fire Dwarf turned around and hid behind the battlements. He saw with his own eyes that one of his clansmen was disfigured just by touching some strong acid saliva. The skin made of brass turned blue and green with rust. This guy can spit sulfuric acid. It must be very scary when it's drunk. A vengeful soul drowned in his own vomit. Ha ha! As if recalling some proverbs from his hometown, the short and strong warrior suddenly laughed. His laughter infected many people and dispelled the haze of fear in their hearts. Have a taste of my pickaxe. Even though he was laughing, the Fire Dwarf never relaxed his mind on the battlefield. Because of this, the weapon in his hand was never hungry. Boys, stand together and drown the strange worm in your own vomit. This time, the chief of the Fire Dwarf could be said to have used all his strength. Magus's tooth pierced one of the opponent's eyes. The rest of the Fire Dwarves also took out their dwarf arrows, the double-edged hand axes pinned to their waists. They aimed at the gaps on the scaled worm's body and threw the arrows with all their might. Thick green blood spurted out through the blood groove on the blade of the axes. Just as the warriors were nervously and methodically dealing with the scaled worm, the young blue dragon, who was floating in the sky not long ago, had landed on the sea and stood on the wreckage of a Leviathan derivative. The surrounding seawater washed the wreckage, emitting a moist, salty smell. The dark blue blood in the floating behemoth's body floated on the sea for a long time and did not dissipate. It was as if the sea was coated with a layer of oil film. I feel your pain. Because he was the creator of Leviathan, Keyes had always had a special connection with this creature. When he was close enough, he could feel their feelings. I feel the same. Don't worry, I'll give you a chance for revenge. After saying this, he squatted down and put his palm into the broken wreckage of the Leviathan derivative. The divine power that he had obtained by devouring the camel god in the island world instantly seeped out. With just a little bit of divine power, the adaptive characteristic that Keyes had implanted inside the Leviathan derivative was upgraded again. After that, the life force that had not dissipated in the wreckage was used again. Countless flagella grew on the surface of the wreckage of the Leviathan derivative under the young blue dragon's feet. It gained momentum through their swaying and began to swim on the sea. Like the most voracious hunter, it did not let go of any piece of flesh. As long as the wreckage came into contact with the wreckage, it would turn into the nutrients needed for its growth in a flash. In order to devour the blood floating on the sea, the wreckage even grew a filter-like inlet to continuously collect the blood that had flowed out of the floating behemoth into its body. Even the pieces of flesh and blood that had become riddled with holes in order to provide for the acid mistworm's metamorphosis into a half-demon monster were not ignored. They were all captured and absorbed one by one. Not a single bit was wasted. In the end, the wreckage of the wreckage that contained the biological furnace of the Leviathan derivative was swallowed whole. As if burping after a full meal, the inlet used to filter the seawater was constantly pumping out gas. The entire active adaptive evolution process was nearing completion. It should be about time. Looking in the direction of Bite City, Keyes turned his head and said to the great Vader who had stood beside him without him noticing, "The demon lord may make a big move. By then, we will definitely be busy. The battlefield here will be handed over to my new creation. What's its name? It should be called him. After all, he has extraordinary wisdom," the young blue dragon corrected. As for the name, he's called Yazzie. Chapter 277. From a genetic point of view, Megalosaurus has a very powerful bloodline advantage. Although most Megalosaurus disdain to have offspring with other creatures, they still created many dragon bloodline species through magic. Yazzie is one of them. There's a beast with a dragon's head and a jackal's body. It looks like a leopard and is called Yazzie. This creature's habits are similar to the legendary spike-tailed lynx, but its personality is much more violent. Currently, most of the Yazzies live in the bottomless abyss, making a living by hunting the Tana re-demons. A meal of kindness must be repaid, and a grudge of Yazzie must be avenged. They use their own actions to fulfill their original goal of revenge, and they are unwavering. Unless the Tana re-race is wiped out, these powerful dragon-type beasts won't be interested in anything else. Famous dragon-type researcher Brew, the life of Megalosaurus, the sky seemed to be blocked by dark clouds. Although it was already dawn, the eternal blaze did not rise to the sky. After a night of fierce fighting, even the fire dwarves, who had copper skin and iron bones, felt a little tired. It was not hard to imagine how much the ordinary human warriors on duty wanted to find a chance to rest. I feel that those monsters seem to have lessened. The movement above our heads seems to have lessened a lot. The chief of the Fire Dwarf clan said to a few of his clansmen. He used a rag he found somewhere to wipe off the acidic blood of the scaled worm on Magus Tooth. In order to fight against the giant worm that a board had transformed into, the Fire Dwarves had abandoned the fortifications on the ground. With their digging skills, they took the initiative to drill into the cave and chase after the scaled worm. "Sir," a warrior who was even taller than the chief spat out the sand in his mouth. "Those guys were actually eaten by this strange worm. Because it ate too much, even its digging speed has slowed down." The chief of the Fire Dwarf clan lightly hammered the warrior's crooked iron helmet and muttered, "We are here to catch or kill that worm, not to die. I hope those tall and thin men outside can finish their work quickly." Slightly boosting the morale, The chief of the Fire Dwarf clan was the first to pick up his weapon and drill into the main trunk of the cave that the scaled worm had dug out. The other bug-catching warriors also followed closely behind. In the dark cave, the few fire warriors who were leading the charge. Although the Fire Dwarf chieftain wanted to be one of them at first, the other warriors voted against it. All of them used their racial abilities to raise their body temperature, and their bronze skin glowed with a red-hot light. This way, they could not only provide illumination for the others, but also defend against possible surprise attacks. At the same time, any creature that wanted to attack them would first have to endure the pain of being burned to their body. Of the fire, of the fire, of the fire, of the fire warriors, of the fire, of the fire. It's going to drill again, set up the spike trap, and try to trap it in place this time. The chief of the Fire Dwarf clan ordered decisively. By following the worm all the way, the bug-catching warriors had figured out some patterns. After the scaled worm drilled out of the ground and wreaked havoc, there would be a moment of hesitation when it returned to the cave. It would first adjust its body in place. As long as it was trapped at this time and could not move freely underground, there would always be a way to deal with it, whether it was waiting for the Grand Vader to come or the equivalent sun and pickaxe to clean up the half-demon monsters. In fact, the scaled worm or a board had also thought of this, and there was not much time left for him, because he did not want to accept failure and the terrible punishment that he might suffer after failure. He had no choice but to start devouring the half-demon monsters that were originally his subordinates. Using this method to strengthen himself, he hoped that he could complete the task given by the demon lord with his own strength. I knew it. The scaled worm poked its head out of the soil and opened its bloody mouth. If you want to do something well, in the end, you still have to do it yourself. Thousands of tentacles, and everything. With its mouth wide open, a torrent formed by countless acid worms gushed out in an instant like a crossbow. The only black-robed mage mummy left on the battlefield bore the brunt of the attack, and the sand shield that surrounded it was broken in an instant. This undead creature that Commander Winfong treated as a trump card was drowned in the torrent of acid worms. Crunch, crunch, a disturbing gnawing sound was heard, and a moment later, only a few shrouds were left floating in the wind. The remaining half-demon monsters did not even have time to cheer in victory before they became the next batch of targets of their leader. And due to the power given by the tyrant worm, the scaled worm that a board transformed into could naturally suppress the half-demon monsters that were perverted by the acid worms. All of you become my food. A board stretched out his body in satisfaction. Using his body that had expanded several times, a board surrounded all the half-demon monsters, and its mouth suddenly opened into 4 petals. Help me break out of the cocoon. Like a huge, gluttonous snake, the scaled worm did not even chew and swallowed the last half-demon monsters into its stomach one by one. After finishing this feast, its fat body, which was so fat that its scales were cracking, could no longer restrain the gluttonous soul in its body. The scales all over its body began to flip upwards, and its entire body began to curl inwards. Sharp claws suddenly extended out from its tail, and like a devout believer of a certain god in the realm of pain, it actually whipped its own body in a masochistic manner. The barbs and spikes on the claws cut into its flesh in a frenzy. In the splattering blood and flesh, a huge monster that seemed to be born in a nightmare crawled out. At first glance, it looked like a tall worm with the upper body of a desert elf, but it clearly had a strong demonic aura. Its strange body was covered with pulsing blood vessels, and the front part of its huge, scythe-like upper limb shone with a chilling light. Under the scythe, there were crude, bony claws that were constantly opening and closing. This huge and terrifying monster stood on its 2 hind legs, and its appearance was very much like a praying mantis. I am brand new aboard. It seemed to be adapting to its new body, and, at the same time, it also trained its language ability. Keek keek. Immediately, this terrifying monster smiled treacherously. 2 wings extended from its back, flapping rapidly, and emitting invisible sound waves that could not be heard by human ears. Chapter 278. Due to the resonance, the soldiers who had just surrounded aboard and were about to launch a fatal attack on him began to tremble uncontrollably. It was not because of fear, but it was indeed very painful. It was as if someone had poked a sharpened stick into their chest and stirred it forcefully. Everyone felt that their heart, liver, spleen, stomach, kidneys seemed to have been turned upside down. They were in so much pain that they could not even breathe. Fragile skin. Aboard, who had transformed into a half-desert elf and half-praying mantis monster, walked to the side of a day watchman. Looking at the latter's face that had turned red due to suffocation, Aboard stretched out his sickle arm and said, "You'll break with a poke." Using the sharp sickle blade, Aboard cruelly stabbed the soldier's chest. Listening to the subtle sound of air seeping in, Aboard raised his head in satisfaction and simply pulled out the victim's heart. Eternal blaze above. The flesh worm has turned into a praying mantis. The fire dwarf chief, who had crawled out of the crypt, exclaimed. When he and his companions were setting up spike traps, which were mostly useless now, they had sensed the unusual vibration in the air. Therefore, they hurriedly crawled out of the crypt to investigate. Fortunately, the bodies of the fire dwarves were all made of metal. They were not hurt by the sound of Aboard's wings flapping, but this did not mean that the praying mantis monster in front of them was no longer dangerous. Chi, chi, chi. Infuriated by the words flesh worm and praying mantis, Aboard opened his triangular mouthpiece to the maximum. The segmental muscles between his chest and abdomen quickly contracted, squeezing the air and shooting out the strong acid stored in his body cavity like an arrow. Half of the fire dwarf chief's body was out of the crypt. When he saw this, he could not care less about climbing up. Like throwing a weight into a dry well, he fell to the ground with a muffled clang. Aboard raised an evil forearm high and waved it in the air. "You're lucky." After fusing with so much flesh and blood essence of the half-demon, the demon's servant in the form of a praying mantis had become very powerful. But even so, he was still extremely fearful of the demon lord who gave him such power. "I must first complete the task Master gave me," Aubert warned himself. He realized that even if he was talking to himself, he could not show any disrespect to the tyrant worm. Severely injuring the Megalosaurus pasha is the purpose of this trip. Thinking of this, Aubert adjusted the vibration frequency of the asynchronous muscles in his lower back and stopped the continuous infrasound attack. He was prepared to fly directly into the Great Vader's Museum and start a massacre there. However, just as it was about to touch the ground, a figure suddenly rushed out from the side. After enduring for a long time, the Sun Duty Patriarch finally seized the opportunity. He had already changed into the clothes of an ordinary Sun Duty Patriarch and hid among the soldiers who had just been ravaged by Aubert. Space-rending slash. Curling his body to avoid the demon servant's razor-like claws, the Sun Duty Patriarch curled his body and rolled to the bottom of the praying mantis monster's abdomen. Although he did not use the speed of the Gale combo, the power was still better. His palms, which could destroy metal like tearing cloth, drew across. The surging force was compressed to the extreme, and like a sharp surgical knife, it cut open a cross wound on the demon servant's abdomen. A flame suddenly engulfed Aboard's body at an astonishing speed. The huge insect struggled forward, staggered, and fell not far from the entrance of the crypt. He lowered his head and found that in addition to a wound on his abdomen that was flowing with corrosive pus, the Sun Duty Patriarch had also stuffed a stone shining with a holy light into the depths of the wound. The demon's servant felt an uncontrollable sense of weakness, but Aboard still had a backup plan. He suddenly used his forelimbs to pick up a handful of sand and threw it at the face of the Sun Duty Patriarch who was chasing after him. The Sun Duty Patriarch hurriedly wiped the sand from his face and eyelids, while Aboard desperately curled his body, trying to take out the stone from the wound. He instinctively felt that this dangerous stone would weaken him. His body was still burning, and it seemed to be getting worse. He barely grabbed the handle of the dagger and tried to throw it to the side. However, when he grabbed the stone, the pain became so intense that he could not help but let out a tragic cry. "I definitely will. I will tie him to the pillar, then peel off every inch of his skin, every piece of muscle, and watch his heart still beating. The brutal demon servant thought to himself, trying to ignore the pain by imagining his evil plan. "How are you?" Commander Wenfeng arrived late, but he had been paying attention to the battle here. As soon as he arrived, a shield summoned by enchanted equipment appeared in front of him, firmly protecting himself and the Sun Duty Patriarch. Don't chase a desperate enemy. That piece of amber is condensed from the essence oil of Chongshan, extracted from the feathers of the blazing divine servant mixed with other materials. The Grand Vader said that as long as it enters the body of a demon creature, even a Baylor will lose a layer of skin even if it doesn't die. Unlike Commander Wenfeng, who was used to relying on strategies to fight, the Sun Duty Patriarch, who was a top warrior, trusted his combat intuition more. His intuition told him that the monster in front of him, which seemed to be in a terrible state, was not at the end of the road. Could it be that aboard Watson's mantis monster was stronger than a Baylor? The answer was definitely no, but the power given to him by the demon lord was more or less strange. After trying to take out the Chongshan essence oil amber, but to no avail, aboard hardened his heart and chanted an incantation. This incantation was like a key, opening the gates all over his body. In a flash, acid mist worms gushed out of his body, avoiding the shell that was ignited by the essence oil of Chongshan and reconstructing another body. It's so painful. As if it had been reborn, a slightly smaller mantis monster appeared on the spot. He could not help but roar loudly. To him, the disintegration and reconstruction just now was also a nightmarish experience. "You bastards, you can't do anything." A dull roar suddenly sounded from behind aboard. "Because you're going to die without leaving a trace." His words were interrupted, and aboard was shocked, angry, and terrified at the same time. However, before he could react or make any defensive reactions, his body was hit by a spell. Grievance of the eyes. The crimson runes turned into chains and stuck to the back of the mantis monster. Without any warning, these chains sank deep into aboard's body. His abilities were instantly reduced by 70% or 80%. He instantly felt like he was sitting on pins and needles. Chapter 279. Being targeted by the Yazi's grudge, aboard realized that the few abilities that the tyrant worm had given him were all restricted. Whether it was the 10,000 worms disintegration that he had just used or the blood rage ability that was similar to the Breza demons, he was unable to use them now. And the one that caused this effect was the magical beast that the young blue dragon had used the remains of the Leviathan derivative with the help of divine power to transform and upgrade, the Yazi. The Yazi had a slender body from head to tail and was about 30 feet long. Red scales covered its entire body, covering its bulging muscles. On its long neck was a head that resembled a megalosaurus, and the horn on its head was constantly flashing with crimson thunderbolts. When it was first born, the Yazi had not only absorbed the remains of the Leviathan derivative, but it had also absorbed the demon's flesh and blood left on the remains. The near-omnipotent divine power allowed this newborn magical beast to have a natural advantage over the demons. Aboard, who had transformed into a mantis monster, had the unique ability to devour all kinds of demons, and this was the reason why the Yazi's grudge could completely restrain him. Debts must be repaid. The magical beast's dragon head opened its bloody mouth, and its dagger-like teeth shone with a cold light. Like a cat pouncing on a snake, the Yazi pounced on the first prey on its path of vengeance. "You're really passionate." Then, when they were fighting face to face, aboard was no longer worried about his gains and losses. His opponent no longer released any strange abilities, and he was very confident in his current body. "I can't be cold anymore." The mantis monster's forearms bent slightly, and the strength of its muscles exploded. The scythe danced in front of its chest, and in an instant, it made dozens of slashes. But to its surprise, even though its senses clearly told it that it had already slashed its target, the other party was like a shadow, allowing the scythe to slash through its body without any harm. This was the second unique ability of the Yazi, similar to some creatures that could hide all or part of themselves in the Shadow Realm. It could transfer a part of its body at any time, temporarily projecting it into the astral world to avoid the enemy's attack. A board, whose spell-like abilities were restricted, could not do anything to the Yazi that had pounced on him with only physical means. In other words, the mantis monster that had lost the initiative could not dodge and could only resist the Yazi's attack. The situation suddenly became one-sided. The vengeful newborn magical beast seemed to have gone mad as it used its body to suppress the mantis monster. Its two scimitar-like claws flew up and down, occasionally reaching into Aubert's new body and ripping out bits and pieces. Eternal blaze above. Hearing the anomaly above his head, the fire dwarf chief climbed to the edge of the cave again and craned his head. Perhaps this monster is the real lion. Compared to it, the Naroya is just a harmless kitten at best. The general on duty, who had excellent hearing, could still hear his old friends belittling comments about his pet from far away, but he didn't have time to care about other things. Commander Wenfeng, who was standing beside him, was nervously holding a runestone used for communication. We may have encountered a diversion. The intelligence chief of Medic, who was known for his resourcefulness, frowned at this moment. A few drops of sweat squeezed out of his forehead because of nervousness. There seems to be a demon's breath in Bite City, the real kind. As he spoke, he squinted at a board who was being brutally ravaged. Although it was already dawn, the eternal blaze, which was supposed to be high in the sky, seemed to be late and had yet to show its head from the horizon. The whole Bite City was drowsy, shrouded in a thin mist with a faint sour smell. Near the city's land wall, on the street near the terminal building of the floating behemoth of the scale of perpetual order, there were sentries every few steps. It was heavily guarded, and unlike other chambers of commerce, which mostly hired warriors as guards, those on duty were all warriors trained by the scale of perpetual order and warriors of the Dragon Clan. In the sky, a slightly smaller floating behemoth pierced through the dim haze and was flying in the direction of the mooring tower. A team of damage managers was on standby beside the crossbow with a grappling hook attached to the crossbow. Prepare to launch. Crooked Mouth, who had been on standby here since he and his brother One Eye came back to support, ordered while looking at the anchor tower on the belly of the floating behemoth. Raise the scale by 3 meters, set the pulling force to 300 tigers, launch. The crossbow was launched, and the grappling hook flew out. With the squeaking sound of metal chains, the grappling hook hooked onto the bracket of the anchor tower. Tighten, Crooked Mouth shouted. The damage managers spun the winch rapidly and tightened the grappling hook with the power provided by the flesh of the flesh. Okay, fix it now. After a while, the airship was fixed. From time to time, the sound of the cable being released from the pod could be heard in the haze. The captain would rather use the winch to pull the airship down instead of releasing some hot air. In this way, the Leviathan derivative could maintain its buoyancy like a cork at the bottom of the bathtub. Once there was danger, it could emerge at any time. This was a Sentinel, a special model of the Leviathan derivative. It was small in size and did not have a high carrying capacity, but it was fast enough. At full speed, it took less than 7 hourglasses to reach Bite from Nome. When the cable hanging from the pod was lowered to the ground and connected to the pulley block, the elite soldiers on the Sentinel buckled on the deceleration lock made of sand and stone and slid down. Crooked Mouth, who had just been commanding the soldiers, immediately ran over in a few steps. When he reached a distance where the haze no longer blocked his vision, he narrowed his eyes and looked around for a while before finding the target he needed to greet. This was actually not difficult at all. After all, that person was much taller than the other soldiers, although he was wearing a simple robe. As long as one was close enough, when one's gaze fell on him, it would always make one feel like they were looking at a shining light. Lord Jensen, Crooked Mouth, who had never liked to follow etiquette, stood at attention and slapped his right leg hard on his left leg. He saluted respectfully, which was rare. Lord Pasha asked me to tell you that you might meet someone familiar today. Taking off the hood on his head, the sacred samurai revealed a determined face. After listening to Crooked Mouth's words and smelling the faint sour smell in the haze, he nodded and said, "I have a general idea. You must be careful. I have already smelled a familiar scent." As he spoke, Jensen placed the bronze box he had been carrying on the ground. The soldiers who accompanied him did not go far from the mooring tower. They formed a perimeter with their backs to the sacred samurai and were vigilant in the direction of the haze. Chapter 280. The bronze box placed on the ground by Jensen made a crackling sound, as if someone was whipping a whetstone with a belt. The box had 4 trapezoidal sides, and it was decorated with black and red crystals, shining as if it was breathing. The front of the box was the narrowest, and the 2 sides were the longest. There were several pieces of light blue crystals on the lid, forming a special pattern. What surprised the soldiers and Crooked Mouth even more was that the bronze box opened automatically with the sound of energy pulsing. Light blue smoke gushed out instantly and quickly condensed into a shape. "This is the portal to alternate realm?" Crooked Mouth opened his eyes wide. As an illusion mage, although his spellcasting ability was not high, he still had some knowledge. "Lord Pasha, are you going to let them come back and participate in today's battle?" What answered him was a burst of deafening laughter. "They're finally back." A huge figure stepped out of the portal to alternate realm and stepped on the flat ground under the mooring tower. After half a month, the brawny ogre Neru returned to the Ash World again. They're still in Bite City, the capital of the Medici Empire. Lower your voice and be alert of the surroundings. The one who reminded Neru was none other than the witch doctor, Peru. He was calm by nature, but when he learned that the young blue dragon might have met their old rival, he volunteered to come back and participate in the battle. Save your strength and go back to deal with the demon lord. The 3 ogre brothers always acted together, and Brew, who always had an idea, followed behind them. He held a whaling harpoon in his hand and the food box on his back. He led a team of fully armed polar bear warriors, several camel shamans, and some young desert elf-like people. They were the last batch to step out of the portal to alternate realms. The scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce had been cultivating in the island world for a long time. Relying on their orderly management, not only did they gain a firm foothold, but they also gained a group of fans. They would participate in this battle as mercenaries of the foreign races. Originally, according to Keyes' plan, the existence of the island world would still be hidden for a long time. But the sudden appearance of the tyrant worm meant that a demon lord who hated him could descend at any time. The young blue dragon, who had always been lenient with his enemies, naturally did not have the foolish plan of holding back. Of course, before he left, he asked the half-lich Snade to personally add a layer of insurance. Every mercenary who came from another plane had to sign a curse contract to ensure that they would not reveal any information about the island world. Keyes also guaranteed that anyone who participated in the battle with the Demon Lord and could return to the island world alive would obtain the identity of an agent of the Chamber of Commerce and enjoy the lowest discount when purchasing goods. After all, the goods that the Scales of Eternity dumped on the island world were all strategic items with high value in that world. Whether it was papyrus that could carry knowledge or steel that could be forged into weapons and armor, if the local natives could become agents, they would have the right to monopolize those in demand in a certain area. And this, until now, was a special treatment that only the top nobles in the island world could enjoy. Therefore, even if they knew that this trip was extremely risky, there were still many people who flocked to it. Among them, most of them were the shamans of the Camel Empire and the children of the polar bearmen nobles who were at the periphery of the thick, sturdy island. The former desired to pass on knowledge, so they needed a large amount of papyrus. The latter hoped to raise their status, so they needed a large amount of steel to equip their own troops. Some of these visitors from other planes who harbored dreams felt slightly uncomfortable when they passed through the portal. However, the physique of the polar bear men and the camel men was far superior to that of ordinary humans. They only needed to rest for a moment before they recovered. There's something wrong with the smog. It's best to give them some of those pig nose gas masks. As soon as they arrived, The sour smell in the air made Paru, who was used to the fresh and moist air of the island world, feel a little pungent. Out of caution, he took out a gooseneck bottle with a special air-suctioning device and pulled the piston on it to draw some air. The air that was sucked into the gooseneck bottle immediately reacted with a voodoo poison solvent at the bottom of the bottle. As if someone had cast an illusion spell, the colorless and transparent solution turned into a light green color. Then, a wriggling worm of acid mist appeared in the belly of the bottle. "What's going on?" Jason, the sacred samurai, walked over, looked at the bottle, and asked. "It's confirmed that the smog is caused by the gas leaking out of the acid mist canyon." "That old friend." Paru paused and poked a device at the mouth of the bottle with his finger. Another stream of voodoo solvent sprayed out and killed the struggling worm in the bottle. "I'm afraid that he's not behaving himself." In Bite City, undercurrents were surging. The chaos of last night seemed to have faded away. The people who were filled with anger had become sober. They no longer gathered together to push and fight each other. Instead, they quietly dispersed like snowflakes in the winter night. Some bold peddlers had already rushed to the bazaar to set up their stalls. However, at this time, the cycle of day and night was at a low ebb. After a night of patrolling and driving away the troublemakers, the guards felt tired and dispirited. They leaned on their spears and dozed off. On the west side of the central city, there was a bell tower. Every day at dawn, the bell would ring to wake the citizens up. However, the bell of dawn, which used to ring on time, was much later today. It hadn't been rung yet. In the mist, the bell tower was illuminated by a ray of light from the blazing sun in the sky. A shadow was cast on the bell tower. Shrouded in the deep darkness, no one saw the dark shadows climbing up the wall with the agility and dexterity of spiders. 1, 2, 3. At first glance, those specters looked like worms. In the sonata room of the bell tower, the dark shadows gathered in one place. They piled up layer by layer and gradually became thicker. On the floor next to them, two people who were responsible for ringing the bell, together with their colleagues outside the door, were lying on the ground in disorder. There was no wound on their bodies, but they had been forced to embrace death. The pale faces of these victims seemed to be telling others what terrible things they had witnessed before they died. It was as difficult as climbing up the sky to enter the material plane from the bottomless abyss, even for those scum demons. Ordinary big demons, without inducing a large number of blood sacrifices in advance, could not resist the resistance and banishment of such evil and chaotic creatures by themselves. However, the tyrant worm took a different approach. Using the two-dimensional world as a transit station, he first let his doppelganger enter the two-dimensional world. He borrowed a small amount of chaotic force from a limited riot to help himself. Then, by changing from a two-dimensional creature to a three-dimensional creature, he cleverly smuggled into the ash world. The dawn here. The shadows finally finished piling up. A humanoid creature in a dark robe stood up, breathed in the sour air, and said with satisfaction, "It's really quiet." Chapter 281. "Hey, buddy, you're walking too fast." As the morning bell was not rung on time, one of the captains of the Pharaoh's Imperial Guards sent two of his men to check it out, worried that there might be remnants of the rioters gathered there. However, halfway through the journey, the older veteran among the two of them not only slowed down his own pace, but also kept telling his companion to slow down as well. In short, they had been wasting time. "Old Darik, please." Rubbing his forehead, the younger soldier helplessly said to the veteran, "This is the third time along the way. I still want to finish the captain's task quickly so I can go back to the camp and sleep early." Darik looked at his companion, who became impatient. He took a kettle from his waist and handed it over. "This is sweet wine mixed with calming nectar. Drink more to relieve your tiredness. But boy, you have to listen to me, because it is said today's incident is related to the devil. It's better to be careful." After taking a big gulp of sweet wine, the young Imperial Guard smacked his lips. He had no intention of returning the kettle in his hand. His face was full of suspicion. "Old man, listen to me." Those stories were nothing but false rumors. Either they want to make people laugh, or they want to scare people. Devils are not only chaotic and bloodthirsty, they are also soul thieves. Ignoring the sarcasm in the young companion's words, the veteran continued. In my hometown of Archipelago, the poorest people would wear a reed chain woven by their own hands when they died, because they believed that if they encountered a devil after death, they could use that thing to make a deal with the devil and redeem their souls. So what does this mean? The young Praetorian guard stomped his feet as if he wanted to get rid of the cold feeling brought by the thin mist. He glanced at the veteran's wrist, which was wearing a bracelet made of metal wire. Don't tell me you still want to bargain with the devil? If you want to face the devil, you must be prepared, the veteran said seriously. There's nothing wrong with being careful. Under the veteran's insistence, the two of them walked for nearly half an hourglass to the west side of the central city. The thick mist made the two of them not dare to be too far apart. Even the young Imperial Guard, who did not believe in the rumors of the devil, secretly raised his vigilance. Sticking close to the high walls surrounding the central city, they carefully walked along the mottled stone path. Here's something for you, the veteran said to his young companion in front of him. If anything happens, spread some of this silver powder on your weapon. After taking the small cloth bag from the veteran, he finally knew where the faint rustling sound behind him came from. It was the sound of the veteran scraping his silver bracelet with a knife. As they moved forward, the gate of the bell tower finally appeared in front of them. The two of them looked at each other, split into two sides, and knocked open the door of the clock tower in a professional door-breaking posture. Is there anyone? We are Pharaoh's Imperial Guards. We are here to inspect. With a shield in one hand and a scythe sword in the other, the young warrior who was walking in front asked loudly. On the other hand, the veteran soldiers held up their spears and hid behind their companions to support them. Only silence answered them. Be careful. We will patrol around the first floor. The experienced veteran soldiers saw a clue, but due to the captain's order, they still had to take the risk to do a simple inspection. If something is wrong, retreat immediately. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps came from the depths of the empty hall. In such a tranquil environment, it seemed very strange. Rustle, rustle, rustle. Just when I wanted to ask, who is it? There was a sharp sound of air being pierced above their heads. Acid mist worms as thick as an arm shot out and attacked the two Imperial Guards. Identifying the location by sound was a training that elite warriors often received. Even if their vision was blocked by the thick mist, thanks to it, they were able to determine the approximate location of the attack. Bang! The young Praetorian Guard raised his shield diagonally and smashed the attacker with the edge of his iron shield. For a moment, he and the veteran thought that they had defeated their opponent. At least they could interrupt their opponent's attack. However, the danger of the tough, acid mist worms was far beyond the imagination of the two mortals. Although they were hit by a fierce shield attack, they still stared at their target and were not shaken by anything else. What's more, the so-called shield bash didn't actually hurt them at all. Retreat. The veteran took advantage of the gap just now and took out the silver powder in his arms and sprinkled it on the evil-looking flesh worms. His reaction was swift, and the acid mist worms that were affected by the silver powder also retreated. However, suddenly, a few acid mist worms that were crawling close to the shadows on the ground suddenly attacked them from below. The acid mist worm demons that hit them not only tore open the armor on their chests, but also used their sharp ring-shaped teeth to tear off a large piece of flesh. Their core muscle groups were severely damaged, and the two Imperial Guards instantly lost the ability to resist. They fell to the ground and wailed, trying to crawl toward the door of the clock tower. However, along with their helpless wails, they were eventually drowned out by the tide of acid mist worms. Since you're here, Hemter's voice came from the depths of the clock tower hall. His voice sounded like the sound of wet fingers rubbing the mouth of a glass bottle, and it was uncomfortable to listen to. Why don't you come in and talk? Or, are you afraid of something? As if provoked by the words, the half-closed clock tower door was pushed open by an invisible force. The thick door broke through the fence of the door axle and flew straight in. "You stupid, filthy, bottomless abyss scum." The one who used this term was naturally our Lord Demon Count. Kanini, dressed in a black robe, stepped in like a fearless warrior. A follower followed closely behind him. After being insulted, the Demon Lord's clone was not annoyed. The humanoid creature, standing not far away, had the smell of sulfur all over his body, as well as the aura of order that disgusted Hemtar from the bottom of his heart. There was no doubt that he was a greater demon that came to the material plane. As for this slander of the Batsu people, in the abyss, only the weak demons would choose to use more vicious words to fight back. As powerful as he was, he disdained to do so. Enemies are bound to meet on a narrow road. Helmet, who was also dressed in black, walked out of the shadows. As he walked, countless acid mist worms gushed out from the hem of his robe, as if he was going to spread a layer of insect carpet in the bell tower hall. The battle was about to start. Chapter 282. As a demon, and especially as a valedictorian who had graduated from a famous academy, Kanini naturally did not have the resolve to become a vanguard against evil. However, after obtaining information about the Demon Lord from the soul of the Traitor Bar, though, he still chose to personally stop the Demon Lord before the Grand Vexer arrived. Then why did he still take the initiative? The reason was simple. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Attacking a common enemy is an efficient way to form an alliance. Being an ally means that you will not be attacked by the enemy for the time being. Ordinary people would find it difficult to understand the logic, nor would they be able to figure out the calculation of professional indicators, such as probability and expectation. However, this did not prevent Kanini, who had undergone professional training, from calculating the optimal strategy. After a series of complicated and tedious calculations, the Demon Count finally made up his mind to take the initiative to attack the Tyrant Worm's clone. Of course, he did not come alone. Kanini also brought with him the noble mages of the Obsidian Council, an entire team of Pharaoh Praetorian guards, and the former traitor who had gone through an extremely cruel process to stand up again and could no longer betray the Demon Lord. I heard that you've given her a code name. Kanini pointed at the Traitor Bar, though, whom he had resurrected and mocked as he dodged Hemtar's various instant death spells. Something like Taylor. Earlier, the Demon Lord's incarnation had already noticed the face of his former subordinate. Even though Hemtar had never had any concept of beauty because of his race, he still had to admit that the Tiefling spy's current appearance could only appear in the most terrifying nightmares of mortals. What a face! Even Hemtar could not help but exclaim. It was completely sewn from minced meat, and it was probably a knife personally made by the worst tailor. Messy and crooked stitches were densely packed on it, and it was impossible to tell the original appearance of a tailor. With the thought of out of sight, out of mind, the incarnation of the Demon Lord waved his hand and threw out a long whip made of blazing flames like he was swatting a fly, lashing at his former subordinate. As far as he knew, all living things were fragile. He only needed to stab them with a sword, cut them with a knife, or tear off a small piece of their body to kill them. Once dead, they lie still until they rot, and only by some cruel means do they stagger to their feet again. But this woman completely ignored these rules. You're already dead. You should have just been lying there. Without a doubt, the female tiefling spy who had been resurrected from the dead had been granted freedom by the Demon Lord's incarnation. The Demon Count's objective had already been achieved. He killed my assistant. Don't let this demon continue to be impudent. The noble mages who had just barged in, as well as the Imperial guards, all heard Kanini's pretentious roar. They immediately felt a sense of hatred for a common enemy and wanted to take revenge on Hemtar. He had to admit that when it came to manipulating people's minds, no creature could compare to the Batsu people. Kanini had only used the tactic of recycling trash to create the illusion that he had lost manpower. When the time came, no matter if he faced Pharaoh or the Great Vader, he would be able to confidently state that he had contributed to the fight against the demon. After the self-directed opening song ended, Kanini carefully retreated to the back and gave the stage to the others. The Imperial Guard were the first to raise their shields and charge forward. These elite warriors had spent half their lives on the battlefield. Although this was their first time encountering a demon as an enemy, none of them felt fear. They used their round shields to form a solid, wild boar formation. In the rather spacious hall of the clock tower, they did their best to charge towards Hemter's position. The noble mages of the Obsidian Council followed closely behind. They weren't idle either. Not only did they continue to buff the Imperial guards in front of them with spells, but they also cooperated with each other and carefully dismantled and counteracted every spell cast by the Demon Lord's incarnation. Even if these noble mages were actually more used to embroidered clothes, they were still at least black-robed spellcasters. Therefore, these people were outnumbered. Hemtar, who had just arrived in the Ashes Plain and was in the process of gradually adapting, was caught off guard. Many of his offensive spells died before they could be cast. Damn. Due to an unorthodox spell cast by one of the noble mages, Hemtar, who was chanting, accidentally bit his tongue. He glanced at Kanini, who was hiding at the back of the crowd, and thought bitterly, "Since you've already fallen to the point of associating with demons, why are you still blocking my path? Does this plane also want to join Bader's camp?" Facing the side that was already closing in on him, the Demon Lord's incarnation, whose body had just turned from two-dimensional to three-dimensional and was still unstable, could only choose to retreat to avoid the attack. He hurriedly retreated in the hall of the clock tower, the claws on his feet scratching the marble floor. Hemter's thoughts were even faster than his footsteps, his mind constantly thinking of countermeasures to defeat the enemy. The setback in the acid fog canyon plain made him start to take his cunning revenge target seriously, the young blue dragon. Especially now that a senior demon had appeared, he could not be sure if there was still a series of tricks waiting for him. Of course, in order to complete his revenge and stabilize his domain of divinity, the tyrant worm had taught his incarnation some special methods in advance. But Hemtar still could not decide whether he should reveal his trump card now. After all, the strange megalosaurus that had once given him the ultimate art experience had yet to appear, and he could not be at ease. Now, it's not the time, Hemtar warned himself. Then, he dodged again, dodging a sword that pierced through a gap in the shield wall like a snake's tongue. The acid fogworms that had been summoned in advance seemed to have gone mad, desperately attacking the Forbidden Army in an attempt to buy some time for their master so that he could adapt to the environment of this plane as soon as possible. Bang, 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 crackle, bang, 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 crackle. The acid fogworms hit the shield, but they were always burned by the flame shield that was attached to it, the buff effect released by the noble mages. Then, they were torn apart by the scythe that poked out of the shield wall. Finally, when the last shadow projected from the two-dimensional world merged into Hemter's body, the Demon Lord's incarnation could finally heave a sigh of relief. His body gradually solidified, and he would not collapse at the slightest touch. Finally, Hemtar did not have to continue dodging, and he swung his fist to counterattack. Chapter 283. After recovering 70% to 80% of his strength, how could a few mere mortals withstand Hemter's furious attack? Even if he was only the mage incarnation of the tyrant worm, he could still kill a few demons with a heavy punch. Not to mention that those who formed the wild boar shield formation were actually just strong, ordinary people. With a bang, the shield bearer who bore the brunt of the attack, together with the shield in front of him, flew out as if hit by a battering ram, smashing many of the Imperial guards standing behind him. Then, the enemy's dense attack formation was suddenly broken. Surround him, don't give him a chance to breathe. The captain of the Imperial guards was quite experienced. He immediately ordered, surround him, buy some time for the mage. Warriors in the front, mages in the back. The principle was not wrong, but their opponents were not ordinary powerhouses. In the whole multiverse, almost no other race could compare with the demons of the lower world in the ability to open the door and pull people in. Moreover, Hemtar was the incarnation of a demon lord. Not many demons dared to refuse his summons. Just now, it was only because the Ashes Plane rejected his existence. The slightest mistake in the interplane summoning could lead to him being expelled. Now that his body was stable, he naturally wanted to pull some cannon fodder to be his vanguard. Keek keek. He let out a few laughs like an old bat crying at night. The warriors at the front were a little stunned. Their swords had clearly pierced the enemy's body, but they found that it was actually just a shadow. Hemtar, who had no intention of staying here, quickly jumped up and directly teleported to the top of the clock tower. At the same time, he began to chant a spell. All the noble mages present were sure that no human could understand the spell that the demon in front of them was chanting, whether it was the harsh pronunciation or the words full of evil. If a mortal dared to try, they would probably fall to the ground or die after a few words, either from suffocation or simply from fear. Suddenly, a noisy and strange cry came from the distant bottomless abyss, shaking everyone present and making them stagger. A noble mage added "see through invisibility" to his eyes, and only then did he see the invisible figure that had first appeared from the invisible portal. The appearance of these beasts was like a horse with a human body, but their bodies were much bigger than a horse. The low horns on their heads bent forward, and their skin was covered with scales. They were dark red, dotted with scary black patches, and fluffy brown hair fluttered on their backs. They were hunters with strong bodies and muscular bodies. Their iron hooves had claws half a foot long, and each claw had 3 toes. The noble mages had no doubts about their speed and agility. Although they only moved a few times, Savis could see at a glance that they formed a cavalry team that could easily tear the enemy's formation. They wore armor with a complex structure, and a few tufts of short and hard hair could be seen from the gaps. Their faces were peculiarly human and reptilian at the same time. Long and sharp fangs protruded from its long and ferocious jaws. Its eyes were rather narrow and almost completely white, but its eyes emitted a ferocious glint. It was obvious that it was not a pure wild beast. This was a group of Iron Rider demons. These demons were called Abyss Heavy Cavalry, and were famous for their uncontrollable passion for slaughter and thirst for battle. They usually obeyed a charismatic leader called Commander or Patroller, and pledged their loyalty to some Abyss powerhouses in the form of a small team. Of course, this loyalty was very limited. Sometimes, even a change of flag in the team could make them turn their heads and defect to the enemy camp. But at this time, they were more reliable. First, they were summoned by the Demon Lord, and second, they were facing so many mortals. The mercenary Iron Rider demons who liked to clean up the battlefield were looking forward to their reward and breakfast from the corpses of the losers. Without waiting for the arrival of the final commander, the Iron Rider demons, who had not yet finished assembling, could not hold back their thirst for flesh and blood. They spread their hooves and charged at the guards with all their might. "Be careful!" the mage who had discovered the new enemy shouted. Because he did not have time to use Dispel Invisibility, he could only shout to warn the guards who were standing too close to the enemies. The first attack was a rain of arrows. This was what the Iron Rider demons were good at. Many of the arrows were filled with lightning energy, and the moment they hit the target, they would burst out crackling thunderbolts. In the dazzling lightning, a total of 11 Iron Rider demons, who were either holding double-headed spears or swinging heavy flails, instantly tore apart the temporary shield wall formed by the guards and began a crazy slaughter. "Hurry! Prepare the defensive spells against the cavalry." Seeing that the battle team was about to be wiped out, the noble mage who had experienced the battle of 2 armies immediately reminded, "Slow down the momentum of their charge first. Destructive spells take too much time." It had to be admitted that this was a good way for mages to face the charge of heavy cavalry on the battlefield. Unfortunately, this noble mage had never been to the Abyss and did not understand the abilities of the Iron Rider demons. Several stone-to-mud spells turned the marble floor of the clock tower hall into a quagmire. In front of the mages, stone spikes made of granite sprouted like bamboo shoots after the rain, acting as barricades. Some of the more astute ones hurriedly cast Dispel Invisibility in the direction of the enemies to prevent them from hiding. After slaughtering the Imperial Guards, the Steel Cavalry demons turned a blind eye to it. They glanced at each other as if to express their disdain, then moved their hooves and pounced at the noble mages. walk in the air. Invoking their race's innate ability, these demons stepped on the void and charged at their opponents from the air. For a moment, the measures the noble mages had just prepared became mere decorations and did not hinder them in the slightest. Command, mass intimidation. Hiding behind the crowd, Kanini had no choice but to personally block the attacks of the Iron Rider demons for the noble mages. After all, these people belonged to the Obsidian Council and could be considered part of their forces. They could not all be abandoned for the time being. Chapter 284. Affected by the command spell released by the Demon Count, a total of 11 Iron Rider demons flying in the air fell into a sluggish state. Although it didn't last long, the noble mages still seized the opportunity to launch a fierce spell attack. The Iron Rider demons are immune to lightning and poison, Kunini shouted. Don't waste the opportunity. They will soon wake up. In any case, the Batsu people had a very detailed understanding of the characteristics of ordinary Tanaree. With his reminder, the mages of the Obsidian Council cast some targeted spells with specific targets. In a moment, the Iron Rider demon at the front involuntarily became a shield for his teammates and was attacked by many vicious spells, dying on the spot. Of course, as an evil demon, being killed in the material plane didn't mean true death. He only got a return ticket to the abyss, but still, no demon was willing to suffer such an unfortunate encounter. Not to mention that this meant that they would lose the precious opportunity to devour the fresh flesh and souls of mortals. After returning to the abyss and climbing out of a blood pool, the demon would become weak and even degenerate. One had to know that in the bottomless abyss, being weak was a sin. The weaker the demon, the more likely it was to become a delicacy on the menu of its kind, a stepping stone on their path to power. Therefore, no demon was willing to suffer an unexpected disaster in the material plane. Under the focus of the spells, the remaining Iron Rider demons turned pale with fright and quickly woke up from their sluggish state. They stepped on the air with their 4 hooves, trying to avoid the attacks of the noble mages. Shameless retreat. An angry roar came from the void, and a long whip completely composed of flames broke through the air, fiercely lashing the bodies of the Iron Rider demons who were scurrying around. The cracking sound of the whip was loud, and many of the Iron Rider demons had scorched whip marks on their bodies, letting out hissing and painful howls. An exceptionally large leader of the Iron Rider demons, after some effort, finally broke into the ashen world from the abyss. In an instant, the temperature in the whole clock tower hall seemed to have increased. He was clad in armor forged from magma steel, and his huge gauntlet hand held a whip. Every time he swung it, lightning would flash. Compared to his body, his chest and shoulders were much wider. Even the strongest warrior would be overshadowed by him. Pure flames spewed out from his scaly demon body where there was no armor covering his body. Retreat. Kanini immediately reacted. From the appearance of this Iron Rider demon commander, he could roughly tell that it was most likely a Baylor bloodline. And such a demon most likely had roots in the bottomless abyss, and its strength was much greater than that of its own kind. In fact, this Archdevil Count's judgment was extremely accurate. The Iron Rider commander was indeed a descendant of a Baylor. Relying on his mixed blood advantage, he established his own hunting camp in the abyss and served the city lords of the abyss as a mercenary. His name was Pagan, and the abyssal plane he lived in was not ruled by a demon lord for the time being. Instead, there were 24 cities that each governed their own affairs. In the abyss, there was no such thing as peace. Every city was at war every day. The chaotic battlefield was the most suitable hotbed for the Iron Rider demons to multiply. They might be loyal to a city lord today, and after receiving their reward, they could switch to another employer tomorrow. In any case, as long as they could kill, the Iron Rider demons would not be limited by the laughable loyalty. Pavon had led his minions to gallop through that plain for thousands of years. As he continued to slaughter, the leader of the Iron Rider demons grew increasingly powerful. Even the average Baylor was no longer his match. Feeling the call of the tyrant worm, the feeling in the unseen world grew stronger. Pagan, This overlord felt that this was an opportunity to serve a demon lord and also go to a material plane to carry out a grand massacre. He felt that it was very likely that he would be rewarded by the abyss when he returned. Whether it was a direct promotion to his rank or a greater power bestowed upon his body, it would bring him one step closer to the end of his ambition, to become a demon lord of this plane. Thus, the commander of the Iron Knight demons immediately organized his men. He even spent a part of his own power to have more subordinates arrive in the Ash Plane, as many as a complete battle formation of Iron Knight demons. But before he arrived, before he could personally command the battle, 1/11th of this force went down the drain. How could this not make Pagan angry? Of course. What made him even more indignant were the mortal spellcasters who blocked in front of his troops. Could it be that you can't learn to obediently accept your death? As soon as it arrived, the leader of the Iron Rider demons let out a long string of greetings that were full of filth from the underworld. Cowardly, two-legged sheep, despicable creatures that stand upright, mongrel maggots that will never learn to fight properly. It was a pity that after staying in the abyss for so long, they would more or less become ignorant. How could mortals understand the language of the abyss? Other than Kanini, Pagan's insults were just a crazy roar in the ears of most of the mages of the Obsidian Council. Moreover, because they had already received the approval of the chairman, they didn't want to fight the almost full squad of Iron Rider demons here, so no one paid attention to Pagan's words. Instead, they took the opportunity to prepare 2 more spells that might be used when retreating. You actually dare to ignore me. Locking his blazing gaze on the mortals in front of him, the majestic and terrifying Iron Rider commander gritted his teeth and ordered his subordinates. Wedge formation, heavy cavalry charge. Let them see the power of Commander Pagan's army. He turned his head, raised his whip, and fiercely struck the ground. The moment the powerful weapon fell to the ground, dazzling lightning streaked across the marble floor. After the lightning flashed, the ground lit up with fire. The orange-red flames burned more and more fiercely, and soon connected into one. The fire spread and turned into a long carpet of blazing flames. When the Iron Rider demons, under Pagan, saw the flame carpet take shape, they immediately became excited. Their hooves rose into the air, and after rushing over the flames, they began to charge at the noble mages again. The flames first ignited their 4 hooves, and then their entire bodies. But surprisingly, those flames that seemed to have a rather high temperature didn't burn any of the Iron Rider demons. On the contrary, they formed a protective barrier around each of them. At this time, most of the noble sorcerers had already prepared spells for evacuation. Dark magic, fog magic, instant escape, and some of the more powerful ones had even prepared teleportation spells that were about to be triggered. Command, silence. Pagan raised his forelimbs high, and his 2 clawed hooves instantly fell, shattering the marble floor and smashing 2 shallow pits. At this moment, many of the noble mages instantly panicked, and the incantations that they had been chanting and were close to completion abruptly stopped. Chapter 285. Go trample, go ravage, go destroy this mortal city. Watching his Iron Rider demons charge madly at the human mages who had lost most of their spell-casting abilities after igniting their protective flames, Pagan opened his bloody mouth and roared wildly. Let them know that wherever I, Pagan, go, not a blade of grass will grow. My iron hooves will run rampant. After saying this, he did not look at the mortals who were destined to become minced meat. He raised his head and looked at the top of the clock tower, wanting to ask for instructions from the demon lord who had summoned him. Sir, I don't want to disturb your command. Helmet finally answered in a low voice, cleverly making his stance clear. He was well aware of the temperament of the Iron Rider demons and knew how to turn them into an advantage to his advantage. The summoned Pagan seemed to think that he was above the average demon, but as the incarnation of the demon lord, his status was far higher than any demon. According to your wishes, run rampant in this city to your heart's content. However, you seem to have overlooked something. For example, a Batsu lurking among the mortals. After receiving the reply from the summoner, Pagan respectfully lowered his head, but when he looked at the ground that had most likely turned into a swamp of flesh and blood, he found that his expectations did not happen. Those hateful mortal spellcasters had been teleported away the moment before the spears, flails, and heavy hooves reached them, leaving only the furious abyssal knights to trample on the ground. There's a Batsu hiding among the mortals. Pagan repeated Helmet's words to his subordinates, grinding his razor-like teeth. But it doesn't matter. Flatten this city, we can always destroy the motley crew. Hearing this, the steel cavalry demons patted their chests and agreed with their leader. Their mouths also began to shout, as if they wanted to express their impatience through shouting. Pagan, whose body was far larger than his peers, tensed his hind legs and stood up, his front hooves landing heavily. A shockwave traveled along the ground and spread out in all directions. Everything that blocked its path was crushed into powder. In an instant, a small storm broke out in the hall of the clock tower. Unable to bear the pressure, the walls cracked and shattered. Not long after, they shattered with a crash, turning into a pile of rubble on the ground. Surprisingly, the bell tower, which should have collapsed due to the foundation damage, was still standing. It seemed that without the support of the walls, it was nothing. Pagan knew in his heart that the person above him needed a place to stay that suited his status. In addition to being more in awe of the Demon Lord's power, his heart also burned with a desire to obtain more power. As long as I can capture enough souls in the material plane or bring extreme chaos and destruction, I may be favored by the abyss. Understanding this, in addition to the fact that Helmet had said before that he had no intention of interfering with his actions, as long as it didn't affect his plan, he could freely destroy it. Pagan could no longer suppress his excitement. This way, looking around and seeing the street outside the clock tower, Pagan waved his long whip and smashed it in the air with a loud crack. The long whip made of flames instantly turned into a giant beheading sword. Form a dense, charging formation. No need to turn. Directly cut through this city and flatten everything here. We will give them a feast of destruction. The gloomy mercenaries sat at a table in the back row of the Sal Tavern across the street. The tavern was only a few blocks away from the Wharf Street and the Grand Bazaar. It wasn't high-end and was one of the places where uncouth sailors with little income or bad luck stayed. The lighting in this place was poor both day and night. The dim light made the mediocre waitresses and the passable food look good at first glance. A large amount of money passed through the wharf and flowed into bite from the large leather bags of merchants or the small money bags of sailors and dock workers. The money first flowed to the scattered shops on the wharf, and most of it stayed there. A small amount of money flowed into the back streets and alleys, as well as those high-end or shabby small hotels. There was a faded sign in front of the Sal Tavern across the street. On it was a painting of a red-haired woman holding a plate of steaming oyster shells. The woman in the painting was very charming, but her neat hair was very dignified. There were many dilapidated old buildings in the commercial district of the port in the northeast of Bite City, and this tavern was one of them. Over the years, with the development of Bite and the port, almost all the buildings located by the sea had been demolished and rebuilt. Only a few old buildings built by professional craftsmen remained as landmarks. The shops on the surface of the city took away most of the wealth. In the back streets and alleys, there were many merchants and tavern owners who were almost cut off from the rest of the world. They hardly made any bills or paid any taxes to barely make ends meet. Their main source of customers, or even their only source of customers, were unemployed sailors and dock workers. The Sal Tavern across the street, which usually had few customers, was almost full today. Due to the long-standing feud between the two groups, sailors and dock workers had always kept a distance from each other. Sailors looked down on dock workers because they didn't have the courage to go to sea, while dock workers looked down on sailors because they weren't real members of the neighborhood. However, today the two groups were surprisingly in agreement. They were both vigilant against the mercenaries who had been in the tavern for a long time. "Hey, brothers, we have to find the boss." Taking a sip of the light beer in the tin cup in front of him, he found that there was a hint of sourness in the bland taste, which reminded him of the moldy straw bed on a long-distance ship. The person who spoke was an old mercenary, wearing a half-body armor made of leather. His face was broad, and his teeth were incomplete. It seemed that he was a man who earned his living by fighting and killing. The scars on his face and arms were obviously very strong evidence. Such a person would make others instinctively feel danger, and most of these mercenaries looked like this. Therefore, the other customers couldn't help but alienate them. In the past, for those who dared to look at them with strange eyes, whether it was because of their pride or simply because they wanted to have fun, the mercenaries were never stingy with giving the other party a punch full of friendship. But now, they were not in the mood for fun. Not only because they had just spent a lot of energy swallowing the granite-like meat, the charred potatoes, and the strange and appetizing gravy, but also because they were now embarrassingly short of money. Otherwise, what other reason could there be? After completing the escort mission, they originally planned to take advantage of their bulging wallets to enjoy themselves in those famous money-consuming warehouses. But until now, after paying for the dinner last night, their leader didn't show up again. This meant that the mercenaries, who originally wanted to fill their dry wallets with money, suddenly lost their source of income. I know where this batch of goods will be delivered. Another mercenary looked at his companion and said with an inquiring gaze, maybe something went wrong. After all, the leader has never delayed paying us. Maybe he needs our help now. Several mercenaries looked at each other, nodded, and prepared to get up and leave the opposite Sal Tavern. Just as the tavern owner was hesitating whether to remind these vicious customers that they hadn't paid for the last round of beer, suddenly there was a burst of crying and shouting outside the tavern. Clatter, clatter, clatter. The specially trained mercenaries could distinguish the sound of horse hooves from a distance. But the sound of horse hooves was a little too loud. Chapter 286. Caught off guard, the Iron Rider demons plunged Bite City into chaos once again. After experiencing last night's chaos, the city's citizens, who had already become somewhat panicked, once again suffered an unexpected calamity. Starting from the clock tower on the west side of the central city, the galloping Abyss cavalrymen broke through several temporary checkpoints and flattened entire blocks. Shouting crude slogans, they cut through the entire city like a hot knife cutting through butter. The Iron Rider demons didn't stop until they reached the city of Lingang and faced the sea. Along the way, they left numerous broken walls and ruins. Large blocks were set ablaze by the flames attached to the demons. In order to put out the fire, people had to raise them to the ground. Looking down from the sky, at least 1/20th of Bite City had been destroyed. Moreover, this kind of destruction was very thorough, as if it had been repeatedly hit by a huge rock falling from the sky. There were many old wooden buildings in Lingang, but none of them were still standing. Raging fires were burning everywhere, but they weren't the usual red flames. Some were evil green, while others were as black as ink, and this just showed the eternal theme of the bottomless abyss: extreme chaos and complete destruction. Put out the fire. Seeing that his business was in danger, the owner of the Isal Tavern shouted at the top of his voice. He wanted to direct his staff to save the business and reduce the loss. In fact, he was thinking of something else, but didn't say it out loud. If you can't put out the fire, at least bring some pots and pans. However, no one responded to his words, because not far away, those huge centaurs, who had chased the merchant ships out to sea and sunk several ships, were now returning to the Lingang wharf with flagging interest. Ordinary people didn't really know about demons, so when they were attacked, most of them mistook the Iron Rider demons for centaurs based on their appearances. However, not everyone had such a misunderstanding. Mercenaries, who lived by licking blood from the edge of blades, all had good eyesight compared to ordinary people because they had traveled extensively all year round. I swear on my 2 eyeballs, Squareface, who suggested going out to ask the mercenary group leader for money, whispered to his companions beside him, "Those monsters are definitely not centaurs." Do I need you to tell me that? What kind of centaur can grow to the height of a 2-story building? Are you talking about giants? Another mercenary snorted. This was a habit of the mercenaries. Whenever they were faced with danger, This group of mercenaries would always use jesting and derogatory ways to stimulate their fighting spirit. He was already holding a weapon in his hand, but if he didn't tremble so much, he would look much braver. Two legs can't outrun four legs. A veteran mercenary reminded as he glanced at the crumbling ground in the path of the cavalry demons. Normal buildings can't slow them down. If I can win, then I'll fight. If I can't, then split up and run. In the distance, the cuirassier demons were rushing towards the entrance of Sal's tavern. The people who had been listening to the mercenaries' analysis and thought that they were going to have a big fight with those monsters were almost shocked when they heard the mercenaries' last sentence. At the same time, the people who had gathered because they saw the mercenaries with weapons all fled in all directions. In the name of eternal blaze. While fleeing, some of the disappointed people cursed, "May those cowardly mercenaries never earn a single copper debenture in Bite City." Although they were labeled as cowards, none of the mercenaries stopped in their tracks. They were just mercenaries. Even if they had previous experience in dealing with cavalry, such as changing their hooked spears, using lassos, and setting up horse traps in advance, there was no need for them to carry out such a dangerous mission when no one was paying them. Those who were smart enough knew that the monsters were coming here, probably because they saw that the crowd had gathered. As long as they ran faster than the ordinary citizens, such as down-and-out sailors, dock workers, and tavern waitresses, they would most likely be able to escape this disaster unscathed. At that time, they could find a ship and leave directly or stay in Bite City to ask for money from the mercenary group leader. As for the monsters, there would be someone to deal with them in such a big city like Bite City. They were right. After hearing that the city was destroyed, Pharaoh Essidor not only contacted the Grand Vexir immediately, but also issued an order to the Obsidian Council, asking spellcasters above a level of Black Robe to cooperate with the Imperial Guards to eliminate the demons. Therefore, thousands of Imperial Guards formed more than a dozen full battle squads. Under the leadership of several generals, they set off from the camp, passed through the streets of the city, and went straight to the Lingang district. In the past, for the sake of safety, the Imperial Guards had to go out of the city first and then circle around the city. When they arrived at the target location, they could enter from the near city gate. However, because the Iron Rider demons were wreaking havoc in the city, under Pharaoh's instructions, the army did not have to abide by those complicated rules for the time being. They passed through the damaged streets of the city, which made the frightened citizens feel at ease. In addition to the Imperial Guards, many black-robed mages also followed the army, many of whom were members of the Obsidian Council. They would become the key force in controlling and weakening the demons. These damned demons. Looking at the almost ruined bazaar, a noble mage who owned many trading stalls couldn't help but frown. Just like the book said, they only know how to destroy by nature, and there's no way to communicate with them. In his hand was an iron bucket filled with black ashes, an alchemy product given to him by Kanini himself. Under the protection of several hundred Imperial Guards and several black-robe mages, he walked to the center of the street in Lingang District. First, he chanted a powerful incantation that ordinary people couldn't hear, and then he threw the ashes out. The ashes tumbled out of the bucket, forming a dense black cloud that stopped in midair. Long gray lines floated in the breeze across the empty space, like a long snake winding along a blazing road. Suddenly, the thin ashes rushed forward, forming circles of spiraling vortexes that fell to the ground. In a few places, the ash vortexes passed through other ring-shaped gray lines, but they didn't touch each other. On the contrary, these ring-shaped and spiral-shaped gray lines kept at least 3 yards away from each other, so much so that a person could easily pass through them. Chapter 287. An Imperial Guard screamed as his armor and chest were cut open by a sharp spear. His companion beside him didn't even have the chance to scream before his head was smashed by a flail. Soldiers were dying everywhere. No matter what tactics their captains used, they couldn't change this cruel fact. Even though the American and Chi generals led the various flag teams to charge at the front, the soldiers of the Imperial Guards were still slowly being massacred. The Abyss heavy cavalry didn't give them a chance to breathe. They kept attacking the front line of the Imperial Guards. After all, they were not just mercenaries who worked for the sake of Kate's silver. As professional soldiers of Medic, honor and responsibility made them unable to retreat. Is that mage ready or not? General Medic, who was familiar with the Megalosaurus keys, also came to this battlefield. Seeing his men falling down, he couldn't help but feel anxious. Stopping the demons can't only rely on soldiers to fill the hole. Unlike the noble mages who were busy preparing spells, the Iron Riders didn't waste any time. Although they had almost razed Lingang district to the ground, their desire to destroy was still not satisfied. The demons roared excitedly. Their voices were full of ecstasy and expectation. Their eyes greedily looked at the troops led by the big-bellied general in front of them. This large group of prey was like a bloodthirsty wolf seeing lambs waiting to be slaughtered. Just a moment ago, this group of Abyss heavy cavalry had completed a charge. Now they were about to regroup and charge again. Their tactic was like a blacksmith hitting an anvil with a heavy hammer. The purpose was to flatten and pinch the opponent. "Archers, get ready," an officer shouted. Nearly 100 longbows were aimed in the air at the same time. The big-bellied general raised his hand high and watched the Steel Knight demons that were gradually moving closer and closer. Then he lowered his hand. The rain of arrows was like a screaming banshee, making a whooshing sound as they flew toward the demons. Those demons were also bloody. Even if they knew that they might feel some pain after being shot, the minions of the Iron Riders didn't stop. They wanted to put these weak creatures to death. Those demons were also flesh and blood. One of the Iron Riders was shot into a beehive because it was at the front. It struggled and fell to the ground. Because there were too many arrows in its body, this unlucky demon couldn't even lie flat on the ground. But the enemy still stepped over those corpses. They didn't care about the casualties of their companions at all. They were drooling and roaring as they approached the front line of Pharaoh's Imperial Guards. "Damn it!" the big-bellied general cursed in a low voice. "Quick, prepare to shoot again." The archers immediately drew their longbows. The commander in charge of these long-range troops didn't hesitate to give the order to shoot. The demon army was bathed in a new round of Rain of Death, but the effect this time was not as good as before. While they were charging, they used spells to summon many giant iris shields and formed a formation to cover each other. "Those demons are definitely not brainless beasts," a senior sergeant muttered in a low voice. As a close combat soldier, he had to lead his subordinates to stand in front of the archers and fend off the ferocious Ironhoof demons. They learned too fast. The pot-bellied general standing behind the senior soldier also frowned, but he didn't pay attention to his subordinates' words. "Archers, retreat to the back and aim at the enemy's inner circle. Blade-wheel chariots in position. Prepare to charge." "Sir," a black-robed mage shouted. "Can you allow me to look at the situation, mage? Did you just think of supporting us? Do whatever you want." The general was full of resentment towards the mage of the Obsidian Council, who took too long to prepare the spell. So he vented his anger on the other mages. But in the end, he gave a definite answer. With the approval of the military commander, the black-robed mages who came with the army to exterminate the demons were free to do what they wanted. The black-robed mage squinted his eyes and muttered. His hand seemed to have grasped something, and he waved it down forcefully. The ground in the path of the charging Iron Riders suddenly exploded. The demon soldiers seemed to have been bombarded by a heavy stone cannon. A cloud of dust engulfed their figures, and the broken stones from the streets splattered onto them, creating a crackling sound. The archers took advantage of the situation, and in an instant, they completed 2 to 3 rounds of shooting. But the dust also hindered the archers' aim, so they couldn't focus on one particular Iron Riders. So although the enemy suffered some damage, there were no casualties. "Looks like we have to fight in close combat again." The big-bellied general who was experienced in battle immediately noticed this and ordered, "You guys continue to stay in the back. Be sure to use spells to contain the enemy. Now we can only rely on you guys." The black-robed mage bowed his head to the American general. "Thank you, sir." "You don't have to thank me, mage. This is a terrifying fact. After saying that, the big-bellied general urged his mount to gallop forward. He rushed to the middle of the soldiers and pulled out his scythe sword and raised it high. The cast iron triangular spikes on the wheel of the wheel chariot spun quickly. They bravely took the lead and rushed out of the battle formation diagonally from the rear. In order to prevent fear from the demon's aura, the drivers rubbed a special alchemy potion on the noses of the six-legged horses that pulled the chariot. This allowed them to be in a more excited state for a short period of time and run faster. Every blade wheel chariot was equipped with 2 people. In addition to the driver, there was also an Imperial Guard beside him. He was responsible for using both hands to hold the crescent-shaped curved spear on the frame so that when the enemy was attacked, he could cut the enemy's body. For a moment, the chariots sparkled and the horses neighed. More than 10 blade wheel chariots crowded the street. They had no choice but to split into 3 rows and rushed toward the demons who had just walked out of the dust. The infantrymen followed closely behind, forming the familiar wild boar formation, charging forward like a boar. Behind them were the archers with longbows, ready to rain arrows at any time. When they first encountered the Iron Rider demons, the Imperial Guard suffered a lot of casualties. The big-bellied general spent a lot of effort to reorganize the army. However, there was always a reward for the effort. After order was restored, Pharaoh's Imperial Guard finally began to show their true combat skills. This was how a typical assault launched by Medica's army should be fought. The 6-legged horses that had been rubbed with the special alchemy potion dared to let out a neigh in front of the demons. When the blade wheel chariots approached the Iron Rider demons, the archers released their bowstrings. The 2 Iron Rider demons in the front row had to dodge the arrows falling on their heads and be careful of the spears sticking out of the blade wheel chariots. For a moment, their formation was disrupted, so they didn't notice the triangular spikes that were rotating at high speed and were very dangerous. The driver drove the blade wheel chariot and passed by the 2 Iron Rider demons. Although 2 chariots couldn't dodge in time and were smashed to pieces by the flail in the center, the spinning triangular spikes easily cut through the calves of the Iron Rider demons. Chapter 288. Thank God. After brewing for a long time, the Obsidian Council's spell finally took effect as the path of the black ash enveloped all the Steel Knight demons. Spell negation, air walk. The demons who encountered the countercharge of the blade wheel chariots wanted to use their spell-like ability to fly, but they found that their natural ability was limited. They fell to the ground one after another. On the other hand, the Beitar guards relied on the speed of the blade wheel chariots to penetrate deep into the enemy's formation. Although the Iron Rider demons were huge, many of them were still pierced by the curved spears. Their armor was broken, and their flesh was badly mutilated. This wave of counterattack temporarily curbed the demons' offensive. In addition to the contribution of the blade wheel chariots, the archers with longbows actually caused more damage. The arrows that were thrown out were like a curtain of rain, covering the stagnant abyss-heavy cavalry. The infantry took advantage of the situation to rush forward, filling the gaps in the formation, and vigorously slashed and stabbed at the enemies. The streets of Lingang district, which were not very spacious to begin with, were now crowded. The blade wheel chariots and their riders coldly looked at the spears that were gradually useless. They pulled out their swords and wanted to fight the enemies in close quarters. In the rear, the archers continued to tighten their bowstrings and shoot arrows. At this time, the big-bellied general was surrounded by his personal guards, waiting for the opportunity to come. He was alert, looking for weak points. He wanted to defeat the demons in front of him in one fell swoop. After releasing spell negation, the noble mage of the Obsidian Council did not stay idle. He used a spell to freeze the air as if the sky was smashing on the enemies' heads. At the same time, his companions were repeating the previous spell, creating explosions in the middle of the Iron Rider demons trapped on the ground, and reducing the demons' range of movement. At this time, a noble mage suddenly screamed and fell backward. There was a crossbow arrow in his chest, and his skin turned into pus. The moment he fell, Only a pile of bones soaked in blood and flesh was left on the ground. The rest of the Guardians of the Moon looked at their companion's corpse in shock. Big Belly promptly ordered them to continue fighting. Don't stop your spellcasting. Interrupting spells will only give the enemy a chance. After saying this to appease the group of aristocratic spellcasters, the experienced General Medici quickly sized up the Iron Rider demon's troop. He knew that the crossbow bolt was meant to hit him. Fortunately, he was vigilant and changed into a robe before going to the battlefield. His clothes were no different from the surrounding soldiers. On the other hand, the mage in luxurious clothes was regarded as the commander of the human army and thus became a scapegoat. Soon, Big Belly locked onto his target. Following the trajectory of the crossbow bolts, he saw an Iron Rider demon that had been cut down earlier. With its strong physique, although that demon had been shot into a hedgehog and its Achilles tendons had been cut, it was still alive. Lying on the ground, it held a heavy crossbow in its hand and was loading another crossbow bolt. That demon intended to repeat the previous operation and choose another target to launch a sneak attack. But the moment he pulled the trigger, a noble mage, obviously Big Belly was not the only one who had found the attacker, immediately counterattacked and bounced the crossbow bolt back to the enemy. The injured Iron Rider demon looked at the vicious crossbow bolt in horror and felt the skin peeling off from his body. His big mouth with sharp teeth made a cry that was completely different from a human's. He turned his head to look at the mage in the distance. This was his last reaction before he died. The demon's mouth was still widening, but that was because there was no more skin and flesh to close its jaw. At first, the skinless and fleshless figure was still there, but then the skeleton fell to the ground and disappeared under the trampling of its companion's iron hooves. After losing another companion, this group of abyss-heavy cavalry began to become a little anxious. The Iron Rider demons became a group of headless flies, and Medici's Imperial Guards became braver and braver as they fought, and the enemy was utterly defeated. "We're going to win," a young officer next to Big Belly shouted. However, he was no longer excited. The group of demons seemed to have found a vent because of his shout. They did not care about the axes on their bodies. They lowered their heads and charged forward. They knocked the Imperial Guards to the side along with their carriages. The screams of the injured could be heard all around. Suddenly, a big hole was torn in the battle line, and the Iron Rider demons were unstoppable. "Hold on," Big Belly shouted to the soldiers. "Don't let them break in." Although General Medici was fat, he was not the kind of leader who only said, "Charge." While shouting, Big Belly led the guards to fight the strong enemy. He personally cut off the Achilles tendon of a demon and stabbed the sickle sword into the enemy's head while the demon was falling. The gap in the battle line gradually shrank and finally disappeared. The Imperial Guards steadied their position. The huge Iron Rider demons fell one by one, and then suddenly turned into a pool of smelly, foaming pus. Tana Ree, who died in the material plane, mostly disappeared in this way, and then returned to the abyss to be reborn. Looking at the decreasing number of demons, Big Belly curled his lips and secretly rejoiced. Although the demons are strong individually, they are not organized and lack tactical adaptability. His thinking was very representative, and it happened to be the same as many Batsa demon who had participated in the Blood War. But in fact, Big Belly had wronged this group of Iron Rider demons at this time. If the leader of this group of Iron Rider demons, a powerful mixed-blood demon named Pagan, who was used to commanding the battlefield, with the actual combat strength of Medici's Imperial Guards, to annihilate this group of demons, the number of lives would be many times more. So, where did Pagan go? "You bunch of worms." Pagan screamed as the lava armor in front of his chest was hacked apart by an axe the size of a door. I'm going to kill all of you." Woo! The whistling whirlwind sealed his bloody mouth, and a camel shaman who was confronting him immediately seized the opportunity. While this demon was injured by the flying axe of a polar bear warrior, he began to call on the elements to restrain the demon. This was an army from another plane from the island world, hired by the scale of perpetual order. At this time, they were under the command of the three ogre brothers to surround and kill this powerful demon in front of them. Are you ready? The burly ogre Neru was a little impatient. He was very anxious that he had not had a chance to rush over and fight. Brew, have you memorized the way to capture demons that Snade taught you? Chapter 289. Facing Neru's urging, Ogre Brew was a little absent-minded. He opened the food box on his back and took out 2 pieces of floating Rathman biscuits, a kind of seafaring ration that had been baked twice to remove moisture for long-term preservation. Brew stuffed the biscuits into his mouth. Calm down. Don't be impatient, Brew said to his brother while chewing the biscuits. This demon is just a small fry. If Paru didn't need some materials for the golem potion, he wouldn't have captured him alive. Leaning on the ebony spikes, the muscular ogre smashed the ground heavily. According to the original plan, they were supposed to deal with the culprit of the demon invasion together with keys. However, who would have thought that the incarnation of the demon lord named Hemtar would bring a team of Iron Rider demons and allow them to wreak havoc in Bite City? Fearing that the demons would use their old method of using numbers to summon their own kind to flatten the city, the young blue dragon immediately sent a message to Paru and asked the ogre witch doctor to make some golem potion as soon as possible. In the airdrop operation in the acid fog canyon, the voodoo potion that could induce the demons to evolve suddenly and cause the demons to fail in their evolution had proved to be a good way to deal with the Tanar'ri demons. The only problem was that to make the potion, they had to find the living tissues of some senior demons. It was easy in the invincible abyss, but in the material plane, the demons that were killed would quickly turn into a pool of stinky foam. It was very difficult to obtain the genetic material of the Tanar'ri demons, which was an important material for the golem potion. Therefore, after discovering the Iron Rider demon lord with the blood of the Baylor demons, Paru immediately ordered his 2 brothers to capture him alive. He hurriedly used the Pasha's seal, the keys had given him to find a place to make the potion, and quickly made preparations. This task was very important, but it was somewhat boring and not challenging for Brew and Neru. They had brought sufficient manpower. The polar bear warriors and camel shamans were almost all out, leaving only some young blue dragon teenagers who had transformed into desert elves to guard Peru's temporary workshop. Polar bear men were the best warriors. When they reached adulthood, their strength and physique could even crush some ordinary demons of the lower realm. As for the hunchback shamans, they were all experts who had studied the Tao of elements for many years. With the 2 working together, even though Pagan's strength was extraordinary, it was difficult for him to break free of their attacks. Many times, this Iron Rider demon even considered whether or not he should retreat first. If it weren't for his pride and irritation, he wouldn't have been willing to tangle with this group of combat mage squads that were like sticky candy. Through his secret method of controlling his subordinates, Pavon had already sensed that a few of the Iron Rider demons had been sent back to the abyss. War Trample. Iron Rider demon roared. His 2 front legs stomped heavily on the ground, creating a terrifying shockwave. The 2 polar bear warriors who were attacking him were careless and were about to fall to the ground after losing their footing. At this moment, Pagan seized the opportunity and swept the huge beheading sword in his hand. With a crisp crack, the bronze axe in the hands of one of the polar bear warriors instantly broke into 2 pieces. His companion beside him wasn't so lucky because he didn't have time to raise his weapon to block and was beheaded on the spot. Oomph! A cornered beast putting up a desperate fight. Neru snorted when he saw the casualties on his side. He turned his head and said to Brew, "Are you ready with your capture spell? I think I can also capture him alive if I knock him unconscious." As he spoke, this burly ogre who was considered too tall even for an ogre raised his hand, indicating that his ebony spikes were thirsty for blood. "That guy's skin is rough and his flesh is thick. I don't think he'll be killed easily even if I use all my strength." As if to prove his conjecture, Neru rushed forward before Brew could reply. He didn't even turn his head back. This massive creature's agility didn't match his body. He leaped into the air in an instant and aimed his ferocious weapon at the Iron Rider demon lord's head. Sigh. Brew didn't stop his comrade, as if he had expected his comrade's reaction. Instead, he ordered the 2 hunchback shamans who were preparing support spells cooperate with me in casting spells. Try your best to capture them alive." Perhaps it was a stroke of luck, but the Iron Rider Demon Lord, who was about to be hit by the ogre's club, suddenly tilted his shoulder and used his lava armor instead of his head to block the attack of the ebony spikes. Thanks to the many defensive runes, the lava armor's shoulder armor exploded with a bang. The result was exactly the same as when the heavy axe struck his breastplate. Although he seemed to have suffered considerable damage, in reality, the force of the attack was neutralized the moment it exploded. Pagin's body wasn't seriously injured. However, just as the Iron Rider Demon Lord was secretly delighted and prepared to counterattack, he suddenly felt an intense, tearing pain from his back. He couldn't help but roar in pain. It turned out that the flail attached to the ebony spikes, which had been provided by the commander of the mercenary camp in Bator, the unlucky chain demon, had pierced into Pagin's back along with the sharp hooks. Nalu only raised his hand slightly, and a large piece of bloody abyss devil flesh with lava armor was torn off by the ebony spikes. With the successful attack, the ogre roared. He didn't even use a weapon. He just casually threw a left hook at his opponent and smashed the Iron Rider Demon Lord's chin. In pain, Pagin kicked out with both legs and landed heavily on Neru's stomach. Thanks to the ogre's amazing physique and the enchanted steel armor he was wearing, he didn't suffer any serious injuries. However, this only stimulated his ferocious nature. Ru only took half a step back before he swung his ebony flail to sweep away 1,000 soldiers. The animated flail seemed to understand its master's intentions. It naturally wrapped around the giant beheading sword in Pagin's hand to prevent the enemy from swinging it at him, while the ebony staff viciously smashed into one of the Iron Rider demon's knees. Just as Nalu was about to press the advantage and beat up the Iron Rider demon a few more times, Ogre Brew's spell had already arrived. It accurately hit the target, the pained Pagin. Chapter 290. Secret Spell, Body Magnetization. A small pinch of black magnetic powder appeared in Blue's hand. He blew at it lightly, and a strong gust of wind summoned by a spell carried the powder towards the Iron Rider demon's body. Although Lu Zheng was standing in front of the evil demon, the magic wind seemed to be endowed with spirituality. It didn't touch anyone unrelated to it at all. Even the huge body of the ogre wasn't an obstacle to it. The magnetic powder wasn't wasted at all. It landed on the Steel Knight Demon Commander Pagin's body. The moment it touched him, the powder seemed to be able to multiply and quickly spread to the target's body. "Now, quick!" Following Blue's command, the camel shamans who had been waiting for a long time moved. With a simple hand gesture or a simple incantation, the elemental spell that they had prepared in advance was suddenly activated. Rumble! The earth was torn apart in an instant. Thick stone pillars rose from the ground and intertwined with each other, passing through the demon's body, abdomen, and thighs. The 20-foot-tall Pagin was instantly fixed in a cage made of stone pillars. Realizing that the situation wasn't right, the Steel Knight Demon Commander immediately abandoned his laughable pride and prepared to use his innate spell to rise into the air. Even if he didn't turn around and escape, he had to first break free of the bindings. However, how could a legendary-level Demolika's capture spell be so easy to break free from? Because its entire body had been magnetized by a secret technique, and because the summoned stone pillars had been mixed with a large amount of iron element. The Pavon's forehooves barely rose half an inch into the air before it was defeated by the weight of the stone pillars. He tried his best to break free, but the stone pillars that were bound to his body by the magnetic force seemed to be welded to death. The demon commander was firmly bound to the ground. Moreover, as the camel shamans continued to cast spells, more and more stone pillars rose from the ground, and the cage became tighter. Even if he wants to use greater teleportation, he won't be able to carry so much weight. Blue walked up to Neru's side and used his hand to rub the chains on the ebony spikes that had been pulled taut by the magnetic force. The problem is, how do we transport him to Paru's laboratory? The speaker didn't mean it, but the listener did. Pagin, who had already cast glib tongue on himself, understood the conversation between the two ogres. Although he still didn't understand what laboratory meant, the evil in those words made him, an evil demon, shudder. Having fought in the abyss for thousands of years, this Iron Rider demon overlord possessed unimaginable experience in battle. In a moment of desperation, he finally recalled a battle from the past. That time, Pavon had led his heavy cavalry to launch a surprise attack on the other demon castellans, but they had encountered an evil spellcaster who controlled the magnetic golems. The battle had been very disadvantageous for the Iron Rider demons at first, but in the end, recalling the experience of fighting against the magnetic golems, the demon with the Baylor bloodline suddenly felt a fire burning in his heart. His body also emitted a terrifying heat, and even his magma armor began to soften and deform. "You damn mortals!" He felt the shackles on his body gradually disappear. Due to the high temperature, the powder on his body gradually lost its magnetic properties. Perrin used his arms to break some of the stone pillars on his upper body, and then he swung the beheader sword in his hand and began to smash the other shackles. "Wait for me." Before he finished speaking, as if to prove the saying villains die because they talk too much, Pagan, who was busy roaring and smashing stone pillars at the same time, was caught off guard and was hit on the head by the burly ogre Neru, who suddenly went berserk. Clang! With a muffled sound, the Iron Rider demon instantly collapsed to the ground, crushing the remaining rock pillars along the way. Walking to the demon's side, Neru stretched out his hand to test his breath. "I told you, this guy's skin is thick and he won't be killed so easily. Now that he's unconscious, it's easier to take him away." Brew was speechless. Just as the Ogre brothers used their own methods and finally succeeded in capturing a living high-level demon, the young Blue Dragon Keys was also confronting his enemy. The incarnation of the tyrant worm, Helmet Tar, was at the top of the bell tower. Dense, dark energy kept rolling under his feet, supporting the broken bell tower to float in the air, as if waiting for something. Keys was not alone. Beside the Megalosaurus Pasha stood the Paladin Jason and the Grand Vader of Medici. Not only that, the reinforcements from Bite City were coming one after another. Even Pharaoh Essidor had brought the Naroya guards to this battlefield. They were preparing for the attack in full swing. Sweet revenge is about to begin. Looking at the young blue dragon standing on a tower not far away, and then glancing at the ant-like mortals at his feet, Helmet Tar grinned and said to himself, "It's not bad to have more appetizers." Ever since he had just gotten used to this plane, the Demon Lord's clone had sensed something unusual about the Ash world. Because he had ascended as a god in the bottomless abyss, he could feel that this plane seemed to reject the gods. In other words, as a god, he could not help but detest the Ashen world a little. This was very unusual. Therefore, at first, he didn't act according to his nature and destroy Bite City on a large scale. Instead, he summoned a team of Iron Rider demons to test his skills and made sure that the power of the demons wasn't affected. Praise the bottomless abyss. You always prove your greatness inadvertently. Helmet Tar thought secretly, since it proved that the power of the bottomless abyss could still reach here. The incarnation of the Demon Lord was relieved. Moreover, the young blue dragon, who was the target of his revenge, appeared in front of him. How could he give up his target? "I can't let you run away." The same thought emerged in the minds of many people at the same time. Therefore, as the cymbals next to Pharaoh clanged loudly, the surging drumbeats were like heavy hammers pounding on the hearts of everyone. Arrows, javelins, and cannonballs rose one after another, making whooshing sounds that were like blood rushing past their ears. The Medici army that was in formation became fanatical. However, due to the enemy's high position at the top of the clock tower, the soldiers on the ground did not have a chance to launch a wild charge. This allowed the long-range troops to take the lead. Dimensional Anchor, hiding in the crowd, His Excellency the President of the Obsidian Council released his spell at the right time. As a demon count, he naturally knew how good high-level demons were at using teleportation spells to dodge and escape. At the same time, the mages who came with the army began their own attacks. Melf's Acid Arrow, explosive fireball, sound wave impact. All kinds of spells attacked Helmatar at the same time. Among them, there was even a vicious and difficult-to-detect spell like Summon Shadow Killer. Chapter 291. It was like a stone sinking into the sea. Regardless of whether it was spells, arrows, or cannonballs, none of the attacks launched at the incarnation of the demon lord could cause any harm. Like a sponge absorbing water, Helmuter allowed these attacks to fall on his body and turn them into nothingness. They then poured into the mysterious magic circle embedded in his body. This was one of the reasons why he dared to seek revenge in the material plane. Then it's my turn. Good luck. Because he had to be wary of the several high-tier spellcasters present, including the young blue dragon, or because the use of greater teleportation was restricted, Helmut Hal did not teleport directly into the enemy camp to wreak havoc like before. Instead, he recited a long series of incantations and summoned helpers to slaughter the mortal army. Some powdery dust scattered on the square below the bell tower. Many soldiers felt a stinging pain in their eyes and could not help but blink. Not long after, through their tear-filled eyes, they saw a pale head that looked like a corpse appear in front of them. The ears on both sides of the head were like those of a desert elf. There was a tuft of hair on the forehead. 2 yellow fangs protruded from the palate of the head, and a shining black gem was embedded in the middle of the forehead. There was no doubt that this gem was the means by which Helmuter controlled them. These creatures were much taller than humans, even taller than the walrus people that Keyes had seen in the island world. Their skin was dark gray with a little red, very much like the color of rocks. Then, the mortal world demon, a demon-like creature created by the combination of the chaotic aura generated by the chaos in Bite City last night and the alchemy potion made by the essence of the tyrant worm's children, launched an attack on the prey in front of it. That's right, the mortal world demon saw mortals as prey. Unlike other demons, this monster did not have a nearly infinite life. They were catalyzed by the demon lord using a secret method, and they could only live for about half an hourglass at most. Only by constantly devouring mortals could this kind of demon continue to survive in the material plane. Therefore, without any hesitation, the mortal world demon instinctively rushed to the crowded place as soon as it appeared. Here, it had only one choice, which was to rush into the organized army. It was worth mentioning that in addition to the terrifying fangs and sharp claws under the thin body of the mortal world demon, there was actually a hidden power that did not match its stick-like limbs. Often, a mortal world demon could tear a small hole in the formation of Medica's army with all its might. Although this short-lived demon who had been too brave would soon be brutally slashed by blades and axes, and finally turned into a pile of smelly ashes and scattered on the ground by the angry warriors. However, it had to be admitted that they had indeed caused a lot of casualties on Medicus's side by relying on the ferocious power granted by the bottomless abyss. And after devouring the flesh and blood of mortals, the remaining mortal demons would become even crazier and stronger. When you fall to the ground, you will make a very pleasant plop sound. Breakfast, the first mortal world demon to climb to the top of Keyes' tower, did not see the extraordinariness of the people in front of him. After all, no matter how much flesh and blood they ate, they would not improve their intelligence level. This demon thought that Keyes and the others were just ordinary noble humans who thought they were hiding in a safe place to watch the fun. So he continued to mock the young blue dragon who had transformed into a human. Your brain is best eaten raw, and your liver can be cooked into a delicious dish. Listening to the crazy words of the mortal world demon, and glancing at the limited volume of the demon's brain, Keyes nodded thoughtfully. Eating the brain is easy to be infected with the prion virus. The consequences are undoubtedly either madness or stupidity. Without even using holy power to enhance his weapon, Jensen, who had been standing behind the young blue dragon with a sword in his hand, suddenly stepped out of the crowd. Holding a 6-foot-long forged steel horse-slaying sword, he suddenly slashed the body of the mortal world demon from the bottom left to the top right. Chapter 292. Just as the Naroya guards were killing in all directions, a sound like glass shattering suddenly sounded, but this sound was not strong, so most of the people present could not detect the huge horror that was about to attack. Everyone, be careful! With the keen senses of the Megalosaurus, Keyes immediately discovered the uninvited guest on the battlefield. Without thinking, he waved his hand and sent a greeting gift to the dark shadow. Finger of Death. A terrifying blood-red thunderbolt streaked across the air and sank into the center of the dense shadow. In an instant, the shadow shrank violently as if an injured person took a deep breath. All of you shall be slaughtered by me. The flat, thunder-like roar tore apart the cover of the shadow, revealing the huge figure of the summoned creature. Taking advantage of the gap caused by the Naroya guards dealing with immortal demons, Hemtar pulled another powerful demon from the abyss. This time, the demon lord's incarnation found a torturer. He had the worst parts of different creatures: a bear, a mantis, a wolf, and a reptile-like human form. Although almost all the terrifying creatures of the abyss slaughtered other races endlessly and eternally, the torturer was definitely a predator among predators. Not only was the torturer violent, but it was also physiologically stronger than most demons. The characteristics of many insects and wild beasts were integrated into its body, forming a huge and deadly form. This kind of demon constructed an evil soul that was masochistic and liked to kill others. Even after becoming Tanaree, they did not need to hunt for survival, but the torturer still stubbornly pursued the pleasure of killing and eating prey. Squatting on the ground, the torturer's body was more than 15 feet tall. Its huge body gave it a strong physique and vitality. And this was also the reason why this demon was only slightly injured and did not die after suffering Key's finger of death. Because of the pain on its body, the demon instantly went berserk. However, although he knew very well who hurt him, the sadistic slaughterer still instinctively charged at the gathered Naroya guards. In the simple thinking of this demon, a group of people was more than a single person, so the joy of slaughter could also be doubled. Compared to the mortal demons, the torturer was undoubtedly much stronger. Even if the Naroya guards were elite warriors, they could not be a match for a torturer. Seeing that the Medici side was about to suffer heavy casualties, the paladin, who had been carefully guarding Hemtar, suddenly jumped down from the tower and flew toward the demon that was ready to kill. However, there was one person, Pharaoh of Medici, who reacted faster than Jason. No one expected that a Cinder, who was dressed in casual clothes, would also be pulled into the mirror world by the Grand Vader. He was also a powerhouse. Wrath of the Sand Scorpion. A scorpion-shaped rune with clear patterns appeared on the surface of his body. When he slashed the slaughterer's heel with his adamantine scythe, the demon's entire leg swelled up as if it had been stung by a poisonous scorpion. Then, at a speed visible to the naked eye, it started rotting and necrotizing. Chapter 293. Yellow sand covers the sun. Sand scorpion swallows the sky. After recovering from his paralyzed state and realizing that he was in danger, the pharaoh did not hesitate to use Medica's strongest attack from the inheritance of the ancient legendary hero, Essador. The sand scorpion runes on his body flickered wildly, and with an irresistible force, he hit the sadist's knee. With a crisp crack, the demon's thigh, which was as thick as a pillar in the palace, snapped. And this was just the beginning. In fact, even with the addition of the runes, the pharaoh's power could not be compared to a sadistic demon. But the strongest attack was still the strongest attack. In addition to physical damage, it would also leave a more fatal sequela on the enemy. It was as though he wanted to vent his anger on these slaughterers. Taking advantage of the opportunity when the demons fell to the ground, Essinder suddenly stepped forward and threw a few punches. Every punch stirred up a large amount of sand, and the places on the demons' bodies that were covered by the wind and sand instantly melted. The chitin armor and flesh that looked like the outer shell of an insect flowed down from the sadist's skeleton like wax. The demon could no longer hold it in and let out a scream, accompanied by a vague, gurgling sound. Within a few breaths, there was a pool of bubbling liquid on the ground, with some flesh and bone fragments floating in it. Now, the sadist only wanted to die as soon as possible. As long as he died in the material plane, he could escape back to the abyss. And not like now. Because of fear of the majesty of the demon lord, he had to suffer endless torture in the material plane. Looking at the demon that collapsed on the ground, Pharaoh, who had finished the job, finally took a breath. A large amount of sweat turned into water vapor and gushed out from his body, which had risen to an abnormal temperature, and steam rose from the back of his neck. Most of the Naroya guards ran over. They gathered around Pharaoh and separated him from the sadist that collapsed on the ground. The two attendants, who had been prepared, had already taken out the icebox used to cool down. Essador just waved his hand, and they hurried forward to open the icebox for their master, letting the cold air that was wrapped in it quickly release. Demons of the mortal world, demons of torture. As expected, if you want to do something, it's best to do it yourself. Hemtar, who was sitting at the top of the clock tower, couldn't help but feel a little annoyed after his subordinates suffered a series of setbacks. But that was all. He jumped down from the top of the clock tower. Without the support of the dark magic of the demon lord's incarnation, the broken load-bearing walls and all the pillars of the building fell instantly, turning into a pile of rubble. The shockwave gathered the dust and turned into a storm that rushed toward the people in the mirror world. At this moment, the mortal demons who were struggling at death's door separated. It was Hemtar who strode out of the haze. With every step he took toward the medevacs formation, his body grew larger. In the end, the incarnation of the demon lord looked down at his opponent like a mountain. Unlike his manic and weak minions, Hemtar's expression was as cold as ice. He was only observing and considering the situation in front of him. He did not hold a weapon, but his clenched fists seemed to contain evil fire that could burn everything. Just by his momentum, he made the offensive and defensive positions of the two sides in the battle instantly change. In order to eliminate the mortal demons, the Nairoa guards and the black-robed mages who were attacking wildly suddenly stopped and immediately changed into a defensive formation. At the same time, the Grand Weasel, who had been maintaining the mirror world with all his strength, also felt the pressure. As the creator of the mirror world, he could feel that the world he created was being shattered by the monstrous power of the great demon. We can't wait any longer. The Grand Weasel turned to Keys. Seeing that the Megalosaurus Pasha also seemed to have the idea of revealing his true form, he quickly reminded, but it's best to use spells to attack the demon. When I designed the mirror world, the upper limit of the spell strength that can withstand here is very high, but the higher the level of the creature, the more difficult it will be for me to maintain it. The implication was that if the young blue dragon also transformed into his true form and fought with the demon lord's incarnation, it was very likely that the mirror world would be destroyed. At that time, not only could the mortal demons go to the material world to hunt, but the two behemoths, Keys and Hemtar, would also fight in the capital of Medevac. Even if they won, Medevac would suffer heavy losses. Chapter 294. The surging holy power that lingered on the forged steel, horse-slaying sword met with the chaotic evil body of the bottomless abyss. When the sword slashed through, it was like pouring a bowl of cold water into a pot of boiling oil. The crackling sound was endless. But how could the incarnation of a demon lord be so easy to deal with? How could Helmuter, who had previously suffered the poison of the power of virtue, not remember this? Just as Jensen's consecutive slashes succeeded, violent flames burst out from the openings. Bang, 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 bang. Explosions appeared one after another around Helmuter, blowing the paladin away. Some of the foul demon lord's flesh and blood splattered far away. Caught off guard, some of the surrounding Naroya guards bore the brunt and were splashed all over. A mutation occurred immediately. As if inheriting the characteristics of the worm tyrant, The flesh and blood on Helmuter's body turned into acid mist worms after leaving the body and greedily burrowed into the bodies of the victims. Ah, the parasitized Naroya guard screamed one after another. The worm-like demons with disc-shaped mouth parts easily broke through their solid muscles and began to feast on their bodies. Seeing this, Pharaoh immediately ordered the mages to lend a helping hand. These Naroya guards were not only elite warriors, but they were also the precious wealth left by each generation of Ascender to his descendants. Sandguard. In a moment of desperation, Pharaoh could not care less about his high body temperature and the urgent need for his body to cool down. He once again used another inherited skill of Ascender. Relying on the contract he had signed with a powerful existence in the sand elemental plane, this current generation of Ascender summoned a huge elemental beast to stand in front of the Naroya guards and provide them with protection. The sand guard appeared in the clock tower square in the mirror world, seemingly slow but actually fast. The constantly flowing sand formed the body of this giant beast, and its appearance was very much like a king cobra made entirely of yellow sand. In about a breath or two, the body of the sand guard gradually condensed and took shape. Its huge serpent tail coiled around the Medici army, protecting them. The head of the serpent quickly shot toward the tyrant worm's avatar, as if it wanted to use the flowing sand to devour it. Chi! Hemtar raised his huge palm and accurately grabbed the sand guard's vital point. His sharp claws tore through the sand giant snake's body and pierced into it, stopping it from pouncing on him. Evil flames rose and were released from the center of his palm. In that instant, a large amount of sand and dust on the sand guardian's body melted into liquid glass, dripping onto the ground of the square. It was as if a huge snake was bleeding blood. I'm going to lose money again. Keys, who had been watching the demon lord's every move, seized the fleeting opportunity. Thousands of silver cannonballs polished into a shuttle shape were activated by the electromagnetic field and shot out. But it's a good price to take your life. Under the acceleration of the super electromagnetic cannon, the silver cannonballs instantly broke through the sound barrier. Amidst the continuous explosions, the silver cannonballs smashed into Hemter's massive body. Even if Keys was a master of body tracing, he had used the super electromagnetic cannon many times. Coupled with the huge size of the target, it would be unreasonable if he missed. So, there was no doubt that the silver cannonballs hit the target. Due to the damage from the silver weapons, coupled with the terrifying kinetic energy of the super electromagnetic cannon added to the silver cannonballs, even with Hemter's strong physique, it was a little overwhelming. Damn reptile, Hemtar roared. His body was covered with wounds caused by the silver cannonballs. Black smoke billowed, and at first glance he looked like a demon god. I was going to tell you to wait a while, and then I'll deal with you. Without waiting for him to finish his nonsense, the young blue dragon immediately gave him a second gift. As if condensing the air into a solid state, Keys directly released a continuous force field impact from the top of the demon lord's head. Like the weight of Mount Tai, a huge force suddenly exerted on the top of Hemter's head. Everyone in the mirror world heard a crack as the huge demon head suddenly caved in and embedded into the gap of the shoulder blade. If this kind of damage was inflicted on other creatures, even the ordinary demons of the lower realm would have no way of surviving. However, as the incarnation of the tyrant worm, this mighty miracle god appearance was just an illusion created by Hemtar. After being injured, he decisively chose to give up this form and transformed into a half-human, half-worm appearance similar to his original body. He twisted his head twice and broke free from his shoulder. You are looking for your own death. I thought you'd have improved a little, but who knew that you'd only know how to boast shamelessly? Hearing this, Quess, who was standing in the distance, could not help but curl his lips. And as far as I know, all creatures who said such things did not end well. As if to verify the young blue dragon's judgment, the sand guard, which was pinched by Hemtar, suddenly collapsed at this time, and then quickly condensed into a shape. In this way, it escaped from Hemter's grip. Then, the giant yellow sand snake, who was angry out of humiliation, spun wildly and changed its form. From the original dense sand body, it turned into an illusory, flying sand and stones. In an instant, it expanded several times and faintly shrouded the incarnation of the demon lord. In an instant, the wind whistled in the mirror world, and the demonic aura in the middle of the bell tower square was monstrous. Restored to his strongest form, the incarnation of the demon lord no longer had any concerns. He began to squander his power without restraint, releasing the tyrannical emotions that had been suppressed for a long time. Futile struggle. Hemtar casually lifted a large number of square tiles and threw them into the air, scattering them in all directions. Due to the additional spell effect, these stone tiles immediately began to absorb the surrounding sand and dust as soon as they were thrown out. Then, under the effect of gravity, they fell to the ground with a part of the sand guard's body that was absorbed. At the same time, this giant half-human, half-worm demon rushed into Medica's army. He could not stand the endless harassment of these little worms. He just wanted to get rid of these obstacles as soon as possible so that he could focus on dealing with the young blue dragon. Just a casual swing of the sword could cause a terrifying amount of damage. Moreover, from time to time, Hemtar would grab one or two unlucky mortals, pull out their internal organs, and throw them to his companions. Then, the mud-like flesh and blood would naturally reproduce a large number of acid mist worms, desperately crawling toward other warriors, wanting to complete the demon lord's order to parasitize all the enemies. Chapter 295. Compared to the vigorous Naroya guards, the agility of the black-robed mages was undoubtedly much inferior. Therefore, the first ones to be successfully attacked by the acid mist worms were mostly spellcasters who were caught off guard. One of the black-robed mages fell to the ground. Like the other parasitized companions, he soon became like a deflated balloon, leaving only a skeleton. The once beautiful and delicate robe hung on his body like a frighteningly black shroud. He coughed uncontrollably and did not notice in time that the huge shadow had enveloped him. Eternal blaze above, the spell to remove the plague is, I only need... The archdemon reached out and grabbed his head. He crushed the skull without using much strength, turning the rest of the body into a bloody lump of flesh. Then, Hemtar lifted the corpse and shook it back and forth in front of the black-robed mages who were retreating with panicked eyes and trembling bodies. Your fate is sealed. However, the threat seemed to have the opposite effect. Although these spellcasters were already weak because of the constant fighting, they immediately began to work harder. Even if they would die immediately, they had to make the demon pay the corresponding price. It's really, just as Hemtar was about to cast a spell to annihilate all these annoying mortals in front of him, a strange feeling suddenly touched him, and his movements became sluggish. When he looked at the mortal demons behind him, he saw that the same thing was happening to them. It was just that the weak demons seemed to be less affected, but even their movements became slower and slower. What happened? Helmut's brain was spinning rapidly, but his thoughts were much slower. The heavy worm tail fell to the ground. The demon lord's avatar tried his best to cast an escape spell, but when he raised his hand that was still soaked in blood, his eyes suddenly widened. He found that his skin that was covered in scales seemed to have become transparent. He could now see his tendons and bones, but even these places were starting to become illusory. Impossible! The archdemon felt a thunderbolt flash in his mind. He thought in surprise, this is impossible. Back in the bottomless abyss, the tyrant worm had once devoured thousands of high-tier spellcasters. That was how its spellcaster avatar, Hemtar, was born. Thanks to the memories of those powerful mages, Hemtar recognized that his current situation was between existence and nothingness. Only the mysterious power of time could affect him like this. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but try his best to focus his attention that was already somewhat lax. He cast his gaze at everyone present, carefully inspecting them, and finally found the suspected culprit. What surprised him was that it was not a group of sorcerers who used the power of time on himself, but the monarch of the Medici Empire who had previously shown his strength as a powerful warrior, the pharaoh named Ascender. After summoning the Guardians of the Sand, Pharaoh decisively hid behind the layers of guards. At this time, he was holding a round-bottomed glass bottle and slowly pouring the charcoal black powder into the air. Just like how he controlled the wind and sand before, he used the power of his ancestor, Ascender, to make the tiny amount of powder gradually float towards the demons. As long as they were contaminated by a little bit, their movements would become slow. The powder of the scales of the time dragon. In addition to Hemtar, Keys also noticed Pharaoh's actions. Moreover, because the young blue dragon had a dragon inheritance that was far beyond the level of his age, he also recognized what the charcoal black powder was. Keys's mind was instantly on fire. Although the arrival of the demons this time caused the Leviathan's derivative to be completely damaged, and even wasted a lot of shuttles made of silver just now. But if he could get some of the Time Dragon scale powder, these losses would be nothing at all. After all, the Time Dragon was the rarest and most powerful of all the dragons, even compared to the Dragon God. They breathed time, devoured time, and lived in the river of time as if they were the embodiment of time, eternal and immortal. Relying on his evolved active self-adaptation ability, Quest felt his body become restless just by coming into contact with some of the Time Dragon scale powder. It was conceivable that if he could get more powder, the young blue dragon was not greedy. All that Pharaoh had was enough. He would definitely be able to evolve again and even obtain some abilities that belonged to the Time Dragon. Just as Keys began to plan, Pharaoh, who had used the sands of time to temporarily restrain the demon lord's incarnation, shouted, "Hurry up! Everyone start attacking! Use any means! Don't stop for a moment!" In Ascender's plan, using the secret technique and the sands of time to trap Hemtar was only the first step. The subsequent work of causing damage to him would be done by others. During this period of time, the demon lord's incarnation was bathing in the river of time. He actually did not exist at this point in time, so he would not be harmed at all. At the same time, he could not defend against the attacks of others. However, due to the irreversible repair of the timeline, the results of the attacks that were originally aimed at the current Hemtar would immediately be fed back to the great demon that had just broken free from the effects of the sands of time. At that time, the firepower that everyone poured on him would also be used on him. At that time, no matter how heaven-defying Hemtar's abilities were or how strong his physique was, it would be difficult for him to withstand the instantaneous damage of such a scale. As long as the plan worked, there was a high chance of severely injuring or even directly destroying the incarnation of the tyrant worm. But what a pity! The young blue dragon was the first to notice the clues. As he had been paying attention to Pharaoh's situation, he quickly judged that Pharaoh, who had forcefully used this secret technique, was actually an arrow at the end of its flight. If we had held on for a little longer, the demon would definitely not have been able to escape. In the blink of an eye, everyone lost sight of the half-human, half-worm great demon. Ember's escape spell had worked. He was instantly teleported to the high sky of the mirror world when everyone focused their firepower on him. Up there, this time, it was Keys's turn to remind everyone, but he was still a step too late. Before the effects of the sands of time disappeared, only a few spells with increased range hit the target. Among them, the one that caused the most damage to the incarnation of the Demon Lord was the young blue dragon's railgun. Chapter 296. Blood flowed down Jensen's cheek. He was sure that his left arm was broken, but he did not know if the powerful rebound on his breastplate had hurt his vital organs. His breathing was a little difficult, but at this moment, he was at least able to stand up, even though he was not standing straight. Just now, like a meteorite falling from the sky, the huge half-human, half-worm demon Lord Incarnation fell from the sky and attempted to turn the gravitational potential into his ally to launch a fierce attack on the mortal army on Medica's side. Pharaoh, who had continuously used the secret technique, was unable to protect his subjects. The Grand Vader was also busy maintaining the existence of the mirror world. As for the black-robed mages and Noroya guards, they were obviously unable to resist Hemter's fall from the sky. In the face of evil, the Saint Samurai had always been a rebel. Facing Hemter's rapidly falling huge figure, Jensen exhaled and suddenly jumped up from the ground. He waved the forged steel horse-slaying sword and used the Saint Samurai's signature skill, Chongshan, Evil Slash. The pure holy power had been buffed many times, and Jensen did not fight from the bottom, but chose a suitable angle to hit the opponent. The huge monster that was about to hit Medica's formation abruptly shifted a few meters away. It hit the ground. Hemtar, who had an extraordinary physique or extremely thick skin, just shook his head and expelled the dizziness after falling to the ground from his mind. He raised the huge wormtail and smashed it on the ground. Almost everyone was curious about what the other party was doing and why he did not attack the enemy close at hand and instead vented his anger on the ground. Keys, who had been staring at the Demon Lord incarnation, immediately shouted, "Evacuate quickly!" It turned out that Hemtar was preparing for the next attack. Standing at the top of the tower, the young blue dragon could clearly see the huge worm tail pulsing as if it was laying eggs deep in the earth. Art is an explosion. For some reason, it was as if Quest was suddenly enlightened. He immediately understood what the other party was trying to do. Previously, when he was creating the Yazi behemoth, he had read some of the abilities that the Tyrant Worm had given to that subordinate from the memories of the Leviathan derivative. Combining the two, the young blue dragon immediately came to his own conjecture. Just a demon servant using the explosion ability could destroy a floating behemoth. One could imagine what kind of terrifying disaster it would cause if Hemtar, the incarnation of a demon lord, was allowed to use explosion himself. Hearing Pasha's reminder, everyone on Medica's side retreated one after another. No one dared to try and see if they could withstand the attack of the great demon with their own flesh and blood. They desperately retreated to the periphery of the bell tower square. Fortunately, the mirror world constructed by the Grand Dimensional covered the entire Byte City. Located in the central city, there were many stone buildings for them to hide in. Rumble. Everyone first felt the tremors from the depths of the ground, and then heard the muffled sound of continuous cannon explosions. Around Hemtar, who was at the center of the explosion, there was no longer any bell tower square. There was only rubble left. Even though most of the Medicus had already hidden in the buildings of the bell tower square, they could not rest easy. The shockwave of the explosion easily tore apart the outer walls of the hidden building. Many of the beams on the roof suddenly fell off and smashed into the already fragile walls. Dust and gravel fell from the ceiling like raindrops, making rustling noises as if it was raining. As the walls tilted, the rest of the beams also groaned. Without the protection of the walls, the second wave of shock waves rolled up many people and slammed them into the walls that had long been unable to support them. The walls and the ceiling all fell apart, burying them under the ruins. Prepare to organize a rescue. With the help of a few attendants, the pharaoh was the first to climb out of the collapsed earth and rocks. He did not even bother to check his dusty face to see if there were any more serious injuries. The king of Medic ordered, "Be careful of the demons," a cruel and fatal follow-up blow. Keys, who had teleported to Pharaoh's side at some point, lifted a large piece of the collapsed wall and helped the paladin buried in it up. At the same time, he said to Pharaoh and Ascender, "The Grand Dimensional is fighting the incarnation of the Demon Lord. The mirror world may collapse at any time. You'd better organize the citizens of Byte City to evacuate first." After saying this, Keys put the round-bottomed glass bottle in his hand into his dimensional storage equipment without leaving a trace. Due to the urgency of the situation and the fact that there was still some sands of time in the secret vault, the pharaoh did not bother to search for the item that he had lost. In his opinion, the remaining sands of time should have been buried in some unknown corner of this place. As if to confirm Keys's words, The medicus, who were helping each other climb out of the ruins one after another, suddenly heard a creaking sound like glass being broken or two pieces of metal being knocked together. The mirror world, which was used to protect Bite City from the aftermath of the battle, was suddenly broken. In the originally empty bell tower square, many legions appeared out of thin air, encircling Hemtar and the Grand Visher, who were fighting fiercely. The crowd was dense. Almost all of the Imperial Guards had gathered here. Fire the ballista at the demon. Pharaoh's herald immediately found the commander of the Imperial Guards and issued a Cinder's order. In addition, mobilize the army and the citizens to evacuate from here quickly. All of a sudden, the whole Bite City was in an uproar. People walked out of their houses and looked at the Grand Vader and the half-human, half-worm Jew demon in the air. They seemed to be confronting each other, but in fact, they were desperately attacking each other with spells. So far, every spell launched by the incarnation of the Demon Lord had been counteracted by the powerful Grand Vader of Medic, which was why it had not caused any damage. However, when the Imperial Guards began to retreat, and some of the well-informed dignitaries didn't even bother to pack their luggage and rode their camel beasts out of the city, the ordinary citizens still realized the impending crisis. Although following the crowd was not a virtue, after receiving the warning of danger approaching, the citizens, who instinctively sought benefits and avoided harm, quickly rushed to the city gate, which relieved some of the pressure on the generals of the Imperial Guards. At least, they did not need to go door to door to notify the citizens. However, in the face of the flood of citizens, the city gates, which had become a floodgate, were under great pressure. In the south of Bite, citizens began to gather near the city gate without any order. Only a small number of clear-headed merchants or aristocratic families would wisely flee to the northern harbor. There, they could either own their own ships or rent a ship to leave. It was much better than blocking the city gate. Chapter 297. Dry and dead trees protruded from the soft soil. Rotten, grayish-white shrubs curled up and drifted away from the shore. Some skeletons of small animals were half buried in the swamp and on the shore. Some of them had died recently, and there were still patches of fur stuck to their bodies. Dead birds lay under the bare red willow branches, and young turtle carcasses floated in the swamp. The place where the predator and the prey died was not far from each other. A shriveled but powerful hand reached over, and the demon dog-headed man pulled out the food from the mudflat. He didn't care about the sand and the germs on it, and swallowed it all in a few bites. After escaping from the hands of Kanini, a powerful devil count, he had stealthily made his way here, hiding himself. It wasn't until he received a new order from his master, the incarnation of the worm tyrant, that the assassin began to eat a little to replenish his strength so that he could carry out his mission. The fleeing nobles and merchants, staring at the port of Pale Sand, which was about half a kilometer away from the tidal flats, and watching the ships of various sizes that were anchored there, the demon curled its lips. Just kill some of them, and the panic will start to boil. That was the new mission given by Helmtau. When he felt a little full, the demon dog-headed man stopped eating. Like a dragonfly skimming the surface of the water, he swept past the mudflat overgrown with red willows, and under the cover of the morning mist, he pounced on his chosen prey. At this moment, as the largest commercial port in Bite City, it began to become a little chaotic with the influx of people. When the Iron Rider demons were wreaking havoc, the main road of the port had been forcibly demolished. Although the Praetorian army had cleaned up the Iron Rider demons and the Ogre brothers, and even captured the leader of the Iron Rider demons, Pagan, after the Medici nobles and wealthy merchants entered the city one after another, they still found the road very difficult to travel. Moreover, the port was originally the residence of many dockworkers and sailors. Now that the demons were wreaking havoc and their homes were destroyed, these people naturally dragged their families and ran to the port, which they were more familiar with, to avoid the danger. The road was destroyed, and the crowd was piled up. How could the road be difficult to travel be enough to describe it? Hurry up and scram. Make way for my lord, you useless, lowly commoners. A man who looked like a butler scolded angrily, waving his whip to drive away the citizens who were blocking the road. The people who were being whipped were all dock workers. After sizing up the other party's clothes, they were angry but did not dare to speak. Not far behind the butler, 20 fully armed servants raised their lanterns and unsheathed their swords. The light of the lantern shone on the scales and the blade. The lord that the domineering butler spoke of was currently standing in the middle of this group of servants and was tightly surrounded. Sir was a young man in his 30s. As a noble, he had an extraordinary bearing and maintained his physique very well. It was obvious that he was usually very strict with himself. His face was thin, and his facial features were firm. He had an upturned mustache, and the corner of his mouth seemed to always have a disdainful curve. On his head, he wore a helmet with 2 curved horns. He wore a dark green shirt, black breeches, a matching short jacket, and a dark green cloak. Although it could not be seen from the outside, he also wore a set of light, enchanted chainmail. The fully armed noble frowned and impatiently waved at one of his servants. The man nodded and walked towards a crowd in front of him. His metal boots clanked on the stone-paved road. The other servants aimed their lanterns in front of them. Some of the lanterns had a focusing function, piercing through the thin morning mist and illuminating the road. "Mr. Butler, you better not waste your breath." The servant who walked forward took out the sharp blade at his waist, making a clanking sound as he waved the blade in front of him. To deal with this group of lowly commoners, talking with a knife is much more effective, just as he was pretending to hack and slash in an attempt to frighten the crowded city residents. A powerful hand suddenly reached out from a thin mist. It was as if the hand was crushing a withered tree branch. With a light squeeze, the servant's weapon was shattered into pieces. The frightened servant hurriedly retreated and ran towards his companions. The soles of his boots scraped the stone floor, creating a trail of sparks. These guards gathered around the noble, trying to pull him back to a safe place. The lanterns were like a group of fireflies, following the movement of the person holding them, spinning on the road. "Who are you? Why are you sneaking around?" The burly ogre walked out of the mist, his massive figure causing the nobles who had been questioning him to shut their mouths. However, he was no longer worried that the ogre was a demon because he saw an acquaintance, Medica's big-bellied general, an old friend of the young noble's father. The general's personal guards were standing behind the ogre. "Why are you here?" Although the big-bellied general was fat, his eyesight was not bad. Therefore, he saw the young noble's face clearly and asked aloud. "Uncle Regis," the noble greeted first before replying, "the city is in chaos now. We received a notice from the Praetorian Guard to order the nobles and property owners to evacuate themselves. Therefore, I want to retreat to the Kafka." Hearing the young noble's explanation, the ogre man spat in disdain. "Deserter." Then he turned to his brother, Blue, and asked, "I remember that you used to be in charge of military discipline. How do you usually deal with deserters?" "Let's forget about dismembering them. It's too troublesome. Beheading or tearing them apart, depending on the situation and my mood." Blue thought for a moment before replying. The conversation between the ogre brothers infuriated the young noble instantly. If not for the presence of the big-bellied general, he would have already ordered his men to rush forward and kill the 2 monsters first. If the master was humiliated, the servant would die. Hearing that their master was being humiliated, the armed guards were the first to fly into a rage. They thought that the ogres were just 2 ogres who dared to spout nonsense because they were serving the American army. "How dare you, monsters! I really want to tear your stinky mouths apart." All kinds of obscenities surged out before their actions. Although the ogres could not understand some of the Medic dialect, they could tell from their tone that it was not anything good. Suddenly, a morning breeze blew away some of the mist, and dozens of huge creatures, camel shamans and polar bear shamans, appeared on both sides of the street, faintly surrounding the young nobles group in the center. The scene turned cold instantly, and there was a moment of silence. Chapter 298. The young nobleman, who was like a proud jay, finally arrived at the port area safely. The big-bellied general had paid the price of a scolding so that the kid could escape unscathed from the ogre brothers. However, he didn't know that the kid didn't appreciate his kindness at all and didn't understand his cheap uncle's good intentions at all. Old Regis must be possessed. Smelling the salty sea breeze mixed with the smell of human sweat, the young medic nobleman frowned. He felt that his mood had worsened. He actually became enemies with me because of those monsters. How foolish. Under the restraint of good upbringing, even if he was talking to himself, he still chose his words carefully. He used become enemies instead of scolding in order to hide his embarrassment in front of the servants. The butler, who had been following him everywhere, heard his master's complaints and knew that he was unhappy. "My lord, you don't have to be angry with them. It's still unknown whether those guards can survive today." Seeing the light in the nobleman's eyes, the butler immediately knew that his flattery had hit the spot. He struck while the iron was hot. "We'd better board the Kafka quickly, lift the anchor, and sail to the open sea to avoid trouble. I believe His Excellency the Grand Vader will soon finish cleaning up the demons." Hearing these words, the young nobleman finally relaxed. He snorted from his nose and snorted. That's more like it. Medic has always been ruled by the pharaoh and the other noblemen. Why would anyone offend a feudal noble for a few lowly peasants? Old Regis is really stupid. After saying that, he felt the resentment in his chest dissipate a little. He ordered the butler to immediately go and arrange for boarding. Due to his noble status, he could avoid many necessary inspections, so he would probably board the family ship in advance. Just as he was wondering whether there was a stock of fine wine and food on board the Kafka for him to enjoy while he waited, a disturbance in the queue suddenly affected the nearby crowd like a spark of fire. "Blood!" Someone shouted at the top of his lungs. "There's a demon assassinating here. Someone has been killed." Seeing that the port had become noisy and chaotic, the armed servants accompanying the young nobleman once again took out their weapons and formed a small circle to protect their master in the middle. Crying, shouting, cursing, begging, all kinds of negative human language were stirred into a pot of porridge. Coupled with the stench of sweat, urine, and even the almost undetectable smell of blood, this pot of porridge was particularly nauseating. Damn lowly peasants. The butler had just run to contact the Kafka. When he squeezed through the crowd, he was almost pushed to the ground. "My lord, I have contacted the family's merchant ship. The captain said that it's ready and can set sail at any time." The steward's sharp voice pierced through the noise and entered the young noble's ears. "Hurry up. Let the butler lead the way. You guys form a human wall. Don't let those lowly commoners come within a yard of me." After receiving the order, the guards of the house were quite well trained. They quickly formed a wedge formation that was good for sprinting and began to force their way through the crowd, moving little by little toward the dock where the ship was moored. Chapter 299. At this time, the sun was rising from the east. A thin layer of ochre and amber appeared on the horizon, as if freshly extracted grape juice had been sprinkled into pale ale. The sunlight pierced through the mist and cast a layer of silver light on the harbor, making the large and small ships look like black and white silhouettes submerged in the water. Brock exhaled slowly. His exhalation was so slow that no one could hear his voice. He tried his best to clear the air in his lungs so that he could take in a big breath if he needed to take action. As the strongest supreme warrior of the Salem tribe, Brock was well versed in the art of ambush. He would be as quiet as a rock and turn into a gust of wind when the time came. In addition, he had cooperated well with Snade in the island world, so Keyes had arranged for him to be in charge of the rat hunting in Bite City together with the steampunk half-lich. The so-called rat hunting was aimed at some of the spies that Helmet might have planted. Once they found out that they might deliberately cause disturbances, they would hunt them down mercilessly. Unlike the interdimensional mercenaries formed by the three ogre brothers, who were mainly responsible for killing summoned demons, Brock and Snade were more in charge of the demon servants hidden in the crowd. Even if the other party was an upper-class noble of Medici, they would not hesitate at all. In addition, They were not as conspicuous as the three ogre brothers, so they were more suitable for some secret work. Whether it's humans or rats, the most satisfactory arrangement is bound to have accidents. While reciting a poem that he had read not long ago, Snader, who was wrapped in a loose robe from head to toe, shrugged his shoulders, producing a creaking sound that could only be heard when gears were grinding. Even the most meticulous plan can't completely deal with the demon's thinking. Those guys with chaotic natures will always come up with some moths, forcing people to adapt to them. He pointed at the kobold demon that was on a killing spree near the port's anchorage. I thought there would be some decent demon servants, or at least some nobles who had fallen under temptation. Who would have thought that in the end, there was only a transformed kobold? But he actually did a good job, Brock replied. Snade did not comment on this. It's time to act. Even a spark in the bonfire can burn down the entire oasis. We can't sit back and watch the power of chaos grow. In fact, the steampunk Demolic had the same intention. As a drow lich, he was cursed by the tyrant worm. He had to self-destruct his phylactery and be demoted to a Demolic in order to escape. In addition, he had been imprisoned for more than 300 years. If possible, Snade wouldn't let go of any opportunity to take revenge on the Demon Lord. Law Order, intimidate. With lightning speed, the steampunk Demolic suddenly activated greater teleportation and appeared behind the kobold demon that was slaughtering the Medici nobles waiting to board the ship. Then, he cast a spell that caught the kobold demon by surprise. However, to his great surprise, it seemed that this seemingly ordinary demon's servant was quite difficult to deal with. The effect of the Law Order spell only lasted for 1 or 2 breaths before it was forcibly broken free. Not only that, but the ferocious kobold demon also stabbed a sharp, serrated dagger into Snade's heart. If it were someone else, this unavoidable, close-range counterattack would be fatal. However, Snade's body was, after all, a high-end product designed by a goblin who had maxed out his skill points in goblin technology. Its quality was still guaranteed. Although many key mechanical parts were damaged due to the special power that erupted from the dagger, the internal parts were immediately reloaded automatically and restored the functions of Snade's body. Damn it! Due to the temporary overload, the steam vent at the back of the steampunk half-lich's head spewed out hot air, sounding like a steam whistle. Just like your master, you're a troublemaker. The large robe was instantly lifted up, and 2 tentacles with rapidly rotating saw wheels at the top suddenly stretched out. According to the tricky angles set by the program, the tentacles cut toward the kobold demon. At the same time, Desert Elf Brock also arrived. Although he couldn't casually use a teleportation spell like the Demolic, he relied on the recoil from casting a sound spell on the ground to greet his opponent after 2 or 3 leaps. Zap! The sound of slaughter that wasn't very loud, but it could make one's organs boil, reached the kobold demon's ears. This short and ferocious monster's movements immediately stopped. Realizing that it was under the threat of death, the kobold demon didn't think twice. It feinted an attack and turned to escape. Chapter 300. Like a slippery loach, the kobold demon slipped into the sewer. With the help of magic, Brock and Snade caught up with it and followed it into the sewer. The light from their torches made the entrance of the sewer shine with a cherry-red light, like a rotting wound infected by a strong poison. To deal with such a wound, only by cutting off the rotten flesh with a knife could one recover. Don't run away. Even if you have succeeded a few times, Snade's voice spread far and wide in the sewer. You will be tired eventually. By then, my saw will cut your muscles and bones and take out your internal organs. It was a typical psychological attack. With the help of magic, it was almost impossible for the desert elves led by the steampunk Demolic to lose track of the kobold demon. However, in the process of chasing, if possible, they had to find a way to weaken the kobold demon. He was not sure if the kobold demon could understand the language of the central region of Medici, but judging from the short fight just now and the kobold demon's decisive escape, the kobold demon was certainly not a beast that had lost its mind. In the port area of Bite City, although most of the buildings on the surface were a little shabby, the sewers were well built and extended in all directions. probably for the purpose of flood discharge and tide defense. Some of the sewers were even connected to the underground channels. If ordinary people followed the kobold demon into the sewer, they would lose track of it soon. With the intrusion of the kobold demon, Blatch, and Snade, many of the natives of the sewer who had been disturbed ran out. Rats of all sizes crawled out from every corner of the sewer and occupied both sides. They ran back and forth, sometimes separating and sometimes gathering in a group. Their hairless tails were constantly wriggling along with them. Due to their intrusion, the river water in the underground sewer was stirred up. The mud mixed with the salty water was afraid of hitting the gathered rats, so they floated with the rise and fall of the water. However, their green eyes were always fixed on these uninvited guests. Then they launched an attack. With the sound of grinding teeth, the group of rats rushed toward the intruders. They ran and jumped along the ledges and uneven walls and swam through the sewage in the sewer. After gathering together in large numbers, this group of dirty animals transformed into small demons. When the kobold demon sneaked into the port's anchorage, it had obviously encountered a similar attack, so it was quite proficient in dealing with it. Just by using its jagged dagger, it was able to carve out a bloody path. As for Snade and Brock, the two pursuers, they were only a few hundred yards away from the kobold demon. For one thing, because of the limitation of their height, they could only stoop to meet the enemy. And for another, perhaps because they had never met such an opponent as the mouse, their progress was for the time being thwarted. The rats jumped down from the wall, and some even landed on the shoulders of Snade's steam armor. Their claws scratched at the armor, trying to get some fresh flesh. Although it was futile, use spells to deal with them, Brock reminded. This desert elf supreme warrior also had the ability of a sound sorcerer. As long as the rats got close to him, they would be torn apart by the sound waves and turned into a pile of flesh and blood. You are the spell-casting consultant of His Excellency Keys. Hearing the desert elf's words, Snade's movements paused for a moment out of awkwardness. Recently, due to his steampunk-style body, it seemed that he had gone too far on the path of a close combat mage. To prove himself, the half-lich quickly wrote runes filled with magic power in the air. His fingertips lit up with green flames, and the completed runes were also shining. Then, he made another gesture, and the runes spun and flew forward. These runes shone and then exploded. The light arrows pierced through the bodies of the rats and threw them far behind. Their skin and flesh cracked and fell off from their bones, leaving only white skeletons. Well, that's more like it. The exhaust pipe behind his head spewed out hot water vapor, and Snade seemed to be showing off something. This is just the beginning. Suddenly, the air was filled with a buzzing sound. Brock quickly raised the lantern in his hand. The light dispelled the darkness, and the broken shadows were reflected on the undulating water surface. Under the light, hundreds of bones slid across the water, shining with green and white light. At this moment, a hair-raising figure suddenly rose from the water. This thing was as tall as a person when it stood up. It looked like the skeleton of a rat, but its sturdiness was closer to that of an ape. Its white and curled legs were clearly visible even in the muddy water. Like the Bugla demonic ape that lived in the bottomless abyss, this skeleton monster had 4 arms, each of which was longer than its legs. When it clenched its fists, it would reveal sharp horns made of rat teeth and rat bones. Those sharp spikes, which were as dense as porcupine thorns, were almost born for cutting and stabbing, and could easily satisfy all of its desire to kill. A few small bones formed the creature's face, and some of the bones were full of jagged teeth. This is a skeleton puppet. It's a relatively mature technology, the steampunk half-lich explained briefly. He then ordered the newly summoned pet, "Go and kill that thief." The skeleton puppet's mouth was made of closely intertwined broken bones, and it looked quite flexible. After listening to the summoner's order, it grinned and then let out a harsh howl, which sounded like the cold wind blowing through the cemetery at midnight. Before it turned around and left, Snade suddenly thought of something and drew a mysterious rune. The rune quickly turned into a pumpkin-sized fireball and went straight to the unbelievable skeleton monster. The fireball hit the skeleton puppet's chest, and the huge impact made it take a few steps back. The flames surrounded the body of the newborn, undead creature and rose from the gaps of the bones. Its insides seemed to be burning as well. Steam gushed out of the skeleton puppet, but it didn't seem to cause any harm to it. I added a layer of insurance for it. Snade looked at the figure that turned and ran away happily as if it had eaten a tonic. It ensures that if it catches up with the thief, even if it can't defeat him, it can at least seriously injure him. After saying this, the spell consultant, whose professional ability was questioned by his colleagues, finally swept away the frustration just now. He strode forward and followed the skeleton puppet in front of him. Within a certain range, Snade could naturally communicate with the undead creatures he created. Therefore, he walked in front of Blatch and led the way. Chapter 301. Your Majesty, the East, West, South, and North will always need to be sacrificed, Key said to Pharaoh as he stared at the incarnations of the Grand Vader and the Tyrant Worm, who were constantly casting and countercasting spells in midair. As the master of Bite City, Pharaoh naturally had more concerns and considerations. Megalosaurus Pasha, I know the strength of you and the Grand Vader. Even I myself can cast Sands of Time again. Can I control that demon and kill it on the spot? In fact, I don't want to do this either, the young blue dragon, who had transformed into a human, replied earnestly. If not, I wouldn't have proposed the plan of using myself as bait to lure the demon out of the city. Being able to become the king of the empire, Essidor's intelligence was naturally far beyond that of ordinary people. In fact, he had already guessed that the reason for the demon's arrival might actually be related to the Megalosaurus Pasha in front of him. In the previous battle, the demon lord named Helmuter, although he did not directly attack Keys, always seemed to have a special hostility towards him. However, when the incarnation of a demon lord appeared in the material plane, it was the public enemy of all creatures. Even if Essidor guessed that there were some factors involved, he would not take the risk of dividing his camp by questioning Keys to confirm his guess. That would be the real stupidity. Once upon a time, Essidor's father had taught him a saying, "You can encourage the weak, you can spur the lazy, but you must keep a respectful distance from the foolish, for they are incurable." Essidor remembered this sentence, so at this moment, he no longer hesitated and made up his mind. He said to Keys, "Let's go to the port area in the northeast of Bite City. From here, we'll go out to sea and fight the demon at sea." Keys was a little surprised by Pharaoh's decision. He had thought that the other party would choose to sacrifice the southwest district of Bite City. After all, the residents there were only ordinary citizens. But who would have thought that the other party would lure Hemtar to go to the sea through the port area and besiege the incarnation of the demon lord? After all, that place was not only the largest trading port in Medici, but it was also said that after the southern land wall and city gate were blocked, many rich merchants and nobles of Beitar went straight to that place, preparing to take refuge by sea. However, he was still a creature of the lawful evil side. The young blue dragon thought for a moment and understood Pharaoh's good intentions. Firstly, the lynching district had already been demolished by the Iron Rider demons, so it would definitely need to be rebuilt. There was no harm in having the Helmutals clean up the rubble so that it would be easier to clean it up later. Secondly, compared to the southern land wall, the loss of a port that needed to be demolished was undoubtedly more cost-effective from a cost perspective. Thirdly, citizens were the foundation of Bite. More than 70% of citizens gathered at the city gate of the southern land wall of Bite City. If those aristocrats and tycoons died, the ownerless wealth they left in the city could be used for the future reconstruction. The scheming of an emperor was terrifying no matter which world it was in. However, this did not affect Keys's next action. In fact, after receiving Pharaoh's approval, he immediately contacted his companions in the Lincheng district through magic and asked them to prepare to support him. Then, under the watchful eyes of the public, the shadow behind the Megalosaurus Pasha expanded, and then a terrifyingly huge Megalosaurus appeared in the sky above the bell tower square of Bite City. Like an arrow leaving the bow, The megalosaurus fled to the northeast of the city without looking back. Candlelight flickered and swayed in the medium-sized assembly hall. In the middle of the hall was a large oak table, on which a huge map was spread, showing every detail of the terrain of Bite City. 6 or 7 men were talking around the table. Sitting at the head of the table, Eshin was lost in thought while looking at the red line on the map, which covered the Lincheng district and a large area near the sea. He was not interested in the conversations of his attendants and advisors. Not long ago, the departure of the Megalosaurus Pasha had indeed attracted the attention of Helmful. The incarnation of the Demon Lord had suffered some minor injuries, ended the confrontation with the Great Vexual, and quickly chased after the Megalosaurus. After the fierce battles last night, and this morning in the Mirror World, Pharaoh finally had a moment to rest. They also requisitioned the assembly hall of a public administration building near the Bell Tower Square, so that they could arrange the next step of the plan to attack the Demon Lord. At this time, the door opened, and a tall and strong middle-aged man walked in. He was wearing a dazzling silver armor, and a light brown cloak fluttered behind him. Pharaoh recognized the man. He was a subordinate of the Megalosaurus Pasha, and had just fought side by side with him in the Mirror World. "Your Majesty." Jensen knocked his chest with his iron-gloved fist and half-knelt in the etiquette of an audience with the monarch. "I just received a message from the Pasha. He hopes that Medicus's navy can stay as far away as possible to avoid unexpected losses." "Paladin, watch your words," an advisor interrupted Jensen, and the blue robe behind him showed his origin. "The Empire's navy has been preparing for a long time. There is no reason for them to be afraid of battle." He turned his head and bowed to Pharaoh. "Great Pharaoh, the Empire's navy happens to have some shipborne weapons. This attack on the Demon Lord is a good opportunity to test the previous expenditure." Some other advisors also agreed, but Pharaoh did not comment. "What do you mean by unexpected losses? Does the Great Vexual already know what the Megalosaurus Pasha's plan is?" "The specific situation is not known yet," Jensen replied with a realistic attitude. "The message just came. The Great Vexual and His Excellency Keys are dealing with the Demon Lord in the port area. They're moving little by little to the anchorage of the port." Then, he added, "The area around the anchorage is already crowded with people. Now, General Regis is leading the Imperial Guards to evacuate the crowd. However, there are too many ships of the rich merchants and nobles gathered there. It's impossible to evacuate all of them without half an hourglass. If the warships enter, I'm afraid it will be even more crowded." In order to verify Jensen's words, Pharaoh's trusted attendant specially mobilized the black-robed mage to perform a divination spell to prove that the information sent by the paladin was not false. Knowing this situation, even the Navy's advisor could not insist. After all, even if he was brave, he could not make a huge warship of 300 paces sail freely in the congested port. Then, according to the wishes of the Megalosaurus Pasha, Pharaoh thought for a moment and felt that there was still a need to add another layer of insurance. The Navy's ships, led by the commander, gather outside the fjords and wait for the next order. Chapter 302. The young polar bearman aristocrat began to walk toward the ship in the anchorage, but an old camel shaman stopped him. A thunderbolt flashed, and the young man could not help but tremble slightly. The young polar bearman was still at the age of recklessness. His exuberant energy and frivolous style had blinded his intuition. Otherwise, he would never be so impulsive. However, the shaman noticed some details. He smelled a faint and uncomfortable sour smell in the wind. The smell of danger. "Elder, why are you stopping me?" The young polar bearman rubbed his numb palms and said angrily, "Didn't Officer Brew just ask us to search these ships docked at the private port to see if there are demons hiding in them?" The so-called private port refer to the small ports privately built by individuals in the coastal areas in addition to the Medici commercial port and the military port. These ports were specially built for small ships to dock. Most of them were built to smuggle contraband or to evade Bite City's commercial taxes. Since these private harbors were usually places of corruption, it was very likely that they would become hotbeds for demonic forces to breed. After summoning the Iron Rider demons, although Helmuter did not summon the other towers innately, it did not mean that he did not have a backup plan. Therefore, Bru and Nalu sent out some mercenaries from other planes from the island world. Together with a few small teams of Imperial Guards sent by the Big Belly General, they formed a special inspection team responsible for investigating these private ports. There's no need to search. Stopping the rash polar bear nobleman, the old camel shaman waved his hand and drew a mysterious pattern of totems in the air. There must be something in these cabins. Rashly breaking in will only increase the casualties. In order to facilitate communication, the captain of the Imperial Guards who came with the camel shaman and the polar bearman had long been blessed with a temporary glib tongue, effect by a spellcaster. Therefore, he could understand and speak the language of the island world. Speak, you scum! What are you hiding in those cabins? The captain of the Imperial Guards roared as he slapped the owner of the ship anchored at the private port with the spine of his scythe sword. As a military officer, he certainly did not have any good feelings for these lawbreakers. Moreover, when he heard that the friendly spellcaster judged that there might be demons hiding in the cabins, he was naturally more ruthless. Even if he didn't use the edge of the sword and only used the spine of the sword, the person who was whipped would end up with a bloody wound. Sirs, it's really nothing. It's just that a conjurer wanted to make a fortune in Bite City during the Opat festival. She hired us to wait and pick her up when the time comes. We only came to this private port to dock for 2 days to save on the parking fees. Thinking that the other party was not telling the truth, the captain's eyes turned cold. He lifted the blade of his scythe a few inches out of the sheath. This stubborn ship owner seemed to have exhausted all his patience. He's telling the truth. The camel shaman who was casting the spell did not turn his head. Although he was facing the ship docked at the beach, he was also paying attention to the interrogation behind him. His heartbeat is normal, and his body odor has not changed. As it turned out, not long after capturing the suspect, the experienced camel shaman had sprinkled some special herbal powder on the suspect's body. If the suspect lied, some substances secreted by the body would cause the herbal powder to emit a special smell. Based on this, the camel shaman could conclude that the captain was telling the truth. However, the camel shaman still believed that there were dangerous things hidden in the cabin that did not belong to this material plane. You'd better send someone to inform Lord Bru right away, he said to the young polar bear nobleman beside him. I can only try my best to block the connection between the things in the ship and the outside world. I can't guarantee that I'll succeed. Knowing that the situation had changed, the young polar bear nodded solemnly. He stopped disturbing the camel shaman while he was casting the spell and turned to communicate with the captain of the Imperial Guards. Not long after, 2 or 3 Imperial Guards rode on the camel beasts and ran towards Bite City. Except for the camel shaman who had to keep casting the spell and the Imperial Guards were guarding the captured captives, the rest of the soldiers pulled the mooring rope together and dragged the ship ashore. Don't get into the cabin. Ignoring the captain's pleas, the captain of the Imperial Guards gave an order to break down the ship. Just stand outside and chisel the ship into pieces. Immediately after, clang, 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 sounds rang out incessantly. The soldiers of the Imperial Guards slashed fiercely with their sickle-edged swords, while some polar bear men picked up more ferocious axes and hacked fiercely. Like hyenas dismembering a huge prey, they surrounded the ship and constantly nibbled and destroyed it. Not long after, a polar bear man cut open the scaly, riveted, and bituminous bilge of the ship and chopped off a small section of the keel of the ship. Under the stress caused by the ship's own weight, a large gap instantly split open from this section of the keel. Many of the weaker bulkheads burst open. People added 1 or 2 more slashes, and many big holes naturally appeared in the bulkheads. Scattered goods suddenly fell from these big holes. There were many goods that were in high demand for Medici. Linen fabrics, steel embryos, Mocha's powdered salt, fanatic armor, culture fluid. These goods fully proved that this ship was not just a cargo ship that carried people and goods as the captain had said. In fact, it was a smuggling ship that smuggled all kinds of goods that were in high demand. Carrying some passengers could only be regarded as its subsidiary function at most. However, this had nothing to do with the camel shaman. He stared at the goods that leaked out and carefully sensed the source of the goods that made him feel uncomfortable and emitted a special sour smell. Finally, his eyes locked on a locked pearwood box. "Open that box," the camel shaman said to a polar bear man closest to him. "Be careful." The polar bear man warrior carefully moved to the side of the box. After aiming, he threw the bronze axe in his hand with all his might. With a pop sound, the rotating axe blade split open the iron lock on the box. Someone even knocked the box down, causing the box to open. An object similar to a cremain ash coffin rolled out, followed by an extremely strong corrosive smell. Even though they were far away, everyone felt that their eyes were a little sore. Just as someone was about to ask, "What is this thing?" a bolt of lightning fell from the sky and accurately struck the spirit niche. Chapter 303. The Shadow Niche was one of the trump cards that Hemtar had prepared for himself. The reason why he had sent the tailor to spread the demon bee venom and create chaos in Bite City was to charge the Shadow Niche with energy. The chaos that broke out among the mortals was a kind of energy which could be collected by the Shadow Niche. In fact, there was more than one of these Shadow Niches in Bite City. When the incarnation of the Devil Lord came, the Shadow Niches would become charging stations, and the energy stored in them would be used for the Devil Lord's squandering. In order to protect these charging stations, Hemtar had cast a powerful dark spell on each of the Shadow Niches. Because of this, when the elemental lightning struck the Shadow Spirit Niche, a layer of dark green energy barrier suddenly appeared and blocked the lightning's attack. "Be careful," the camel shaman immediately warned. He realized that his sneak attack didn't work, so he hoped that the elemental seal could have some effect. "Something is coming out." With a soft puff sound, a gap appeared in the urn of the Shadow Niche. The power of chaos suddenly broke out and hit the elemental seal screen that the camel shaman had set up. The pale golden light film flickered for a moment. Then it shattered into pieces like glass and rustled down. A worm of acid mist, about 3 feet long and as thick as an ordinary person's arm, came out of the Shadow Niche little by little. Like a balloon, it swelled up against the wind and gradually doubled in size. "What the hell is this? Archers, get ready!" The captain of the Imperial Guards, who had been watching from the side, exclaimed. In just a few seconds, the strange worm had swelled into a behemoth as tall as 2 people. However, its tail was still deep in the Shadow Niche, and its body was not completely pulled out. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The archers began to rain arrows on the strange worm from a distance. However, apart from the first 1 or 2 arrows that hit the target and caused a lot of disgusting dark green liquid to burst out of its body, the rest of the arrows were blocked or thrown to the side by the 2 arms that suddenly grew out of the strange insect's body. At a speed visible to the naked eye, the strange worm gradually transformed from a giant worm into an evil demon with 2 horns on its head, 2 bent arms, and a body covered in scales. Only the lower half of its body, which was connected to the Shadow Spirit cage, remained unchanged. Roar! The guardian of the Shadow Spirit alcove let out an angry roar. Its eyes were like 2 ignited briquettes. Green flames several feet long rose from the corners of its eyes. It looked extraordinarily powerful. Attack that cinerary urn. The hunchback shaman was not young, so naturally, he was more knowledgeable. He immediately found the suspected weakness of the demon. This demon should not be able to leave that cinerary urn. After receiving the notification, the Imperial Guard captain immediately noticed this. He quickly ordered the archers, "Focus your attacks on the cinerary urn." Facing the rain of arrows, the giant demon waved his hand. Using the energy stored in the Shadow Spirit Niche, he effortlessly summoned a whirlwind and swept away all the arrows. Not only that, but perhaps to better protect the Shadow Spirit Niche, the lower half of the Demon Guard's worm body suddenly shrank. Together with the shadow spirit niche, they were all absorbed into his abdomen for protection. His two giant claws clenched into fists and slammed into the ground of the mudflat. Using the recoil, he leaped high and launched an attack from the sky toward the temporarily formed mixed inspection team. Everyone dodged in all directions. The formation of the archers and the shield bearers was instantly broken. As for the smugglers who were tied up in place, because they could not dodge in time, they panicked and turned into minced meat. Keek. Having succeeded in crushing the flesh and bones of some mortals, the demon guard was overjoyed and roared involuntarily. However, he had obviously underestimated his opponent. The hunchback shaman seized this opportunity. He flipped his palms upward and suddenly clapped them together. As he cast a spell, two giant claws made of mud suddenly rose from the mudflat and grabbed at the demon guard. Bang! Bang! It was hard to tell which came first. The demon guard used his arms to block the attack of the mud claws. One tried to close, the other tried to open. They wrestled with each other. This undoubtedly created an opportunity for everyone. In addition to the archers once again unleashing a torrent of arrows, some brave warriors of the polar bear people, as well as the sword-shield soldiers of the Forbidden Army, stepped on the mud-like ground and charged towards the demon guards. Although the demon guard was comparable to a giant and was even 3 times the size of the polar bear men, it also gave the warriors a chance to show their bravery. Because he had just put away the shadow spirit niche, everyone present was certain of his weakness. Therefore, most of their attacks were aimed at the demon guard's abdomen. They wanted to first cut open his abdomen and then smash the shadow spirit niche. Roar! Seeing that he was about to be hit by the axe, the demon guard suddenly exploded with more power. The flames at the corner of his eyes soared and burned fiercely. A pair of wings grew out of his back, and he flapped them to fly into the sky. The two mud claws worked together, but they grabbed empty air. In the palms of the demon guard, balls of green flames were constantly clenched and ruthlessly thrown at the warriors gathered under him. Although they didn't hit their targets, some of them couldn't dodge in time and were still infected by the green flames. Then, they screamed in horror and quickly turned into ashes. Not even bones were left. Fear was a type of immediate whipping that was enough to make many people retreat in the face of adversity. However, it was not effective for everyone. While this demon guard was wantonly unleashing fire rain from the sky, a spear with a barb and a rope tied to its tail suddenly attacked from behind. Before the demon guard could react, the spear pierced through the target and pierced through it. Everyone, come over and pull him down together. The young polar bearman noble who had been dissuaded by the hunchback shaman clearly learned his lesson. He didn't act rashly during the battle. Instead, he hid in the demon guard's blind spot and took advantage of it to launch a sneak attack. But before everyone had time to rejoice, the huge demon took a deep breath. Regardless of how much flesh the barbed spear pulled out from his body, his whole body shrank. Then, he suddenly exhaled a large cloud of green flames. Just like the burning cloud spell, the ring of flames suddenly exploded with the fiend guard as the center. All of you retreat, the old shaman roared. Seeing that he couldn't leave, he simply used all his strength to cast a magic shield, wanting to create a chance for the others to escape. But suddenly, a black shadow flashed. The demon guard that was exploding was like a puncture balloon. With a pop sound, he fell straight into the mud of the beach. Chapter 304. The Yazi behemoth swam ashore. It ignored the eruption of flames and shot down the demon guard hovering in the air to the ground like a cat catching a butterfly. The green flames, infected with the power of the demon, did not seem to hurt it at all. It did not even ignite a single hair on the Yazi's body. However, the behemoth's sharp claws easily pierced the demon guard's body and took out the shadow spirit niche hidden in it. A cruel smile appeared on the Yazi's ferocious dragon head. Demon, he stared at his opponent who was pressed into the ground. The demon guard, who was originally moving freely, seemed to have met its natural enemy and did not dare to move. It's better to die. The Yazi's sharp claws flew up and down. After a few slaps, the demon was turned into pieces on the ground. Immediately, a blazing dragon flame was spat out from its mouth, burning the filth on the ground into ashes. Intimidated by his aura, none of the polar bear men, hunchback shamans, and imperial guards around him dared to move. I'm the helper summoned by Sir Keys. Just like the way he communicated with the demon guard, the Yazi communicated with everyone present with his psionic ability, especially for the few commanders, the camel shaman, the captain of the imperial guards, and the polar bearman nobleman. He also specifically asked, "Do you know what Sir plans to do next?" While raising his claws and using the hot steam from his mouth to wash his claws, he waited for the leader of the little people in front of him to provide him with some answers. Knowing that the newcomer was not an enemy, the people present relaxed a little, but how to communicate with the Yazi became a problem. Not everyone could communicate with the psionic ability as easily as he and Keys. In the end, the camel shaman cast a shaman spell that could listen to the language of nature on the Yazi behemoth. With the help of the breeze formed by the air element, he stumbled to convey some information to the Yazi behemoth. Ossuary power of the demon, suspected storage, recommended to destroy directly Sir Keys' battle in the city. Fortunately, Yazi's intelligence was not low. He looked at the shadow shrine that was taken out from the body of the demon guard and threw it aside. With him present, the camel shaman and the others could not take the initiative to deal with it. Without even thinking, his long tail whipped the shadow spirit niche like an iron whip, bringing with it the sound of wind. With a kacha sound, this magical item turned into fragments under the tremendous power of Yazi. The green smoke that contained the power of chaos gushed out of the spirit niche and showed signs of dissipating before being sucked into Yazi's stomach. As its body had fused with a large amount of genetic material from the Thanner-reeked demon, Yazi seemed to have eaten a great tonic in an instant. This fusion beast's hair and beard all stood up as it roared towards the sky. Unlike Yazi, who was excited because of the increase in its strength, Hemtar felt that the delicious meal of revenge was no longer delicious when he sensed that a charging station he had reserved for himself had been forced offline. Damn guys, the demon lord's incarnation thought fiercely, "I will destroy this country to eliminate the hatred in my heart." And just when he was furious, Keys had already known the arrival of Yazi because of the special perception of the creator. "I want to annihilate the enemy in the open sea. You sneak into the open sea and ambush first. At that time, clean up the Thanner-Reese servants that may be summoned by him." After giving his order concisely, the young blue dragon tried his best to deal with Hemtar behind him. Using the tactic of fighting while retreating, he tried his best to lure the demon lord's incarnation to deviate bit by bit to the seaside. Medica's Grand Vader followed closely behind the demon and Megalosaurus Pasha. But even so, Hemtar, who was half human and half worm, still did not show any hesitation. Obviously, he still had something to rely on. He still had a trump card that he had not used. Near the anchorage of Lingang District, the crowd that had gathered for less than half an hourglass had gradually dispersed at this time. Among the rich merchants and nobles of Bite, there were naturally some who had arranged spies in Pharaoh's court. So they immediately learned that Essador had agreed to evacuate Megalosaurus Pasha from Lingang District and was responsible for luring the demon away. Like Keys when he first heard the news, they were also stunned for a moment, and then turned pale with fright. The safe choice of going to the sea to avoid danger suddenly became the most risky evacuation plan. It was not that Medic had not encountered the invasion of demons from other planes, but those demons from the 9 prisons of Bader and their mortal worshippers were annihilated before they could advance to Bite City. But this time, the demon chose to descend in the center of Bite City. And so far, the Grand Vader, Pharaoh, and even the alien Pasha from the central part of the Empire, together with the entire Praetorian Corps, had not been able to take it down. The strength of that abyss devil could be seen from this. No one was willing to stand in the way of such a dangerous monster. If the situation permitted, the celebration banquet after the demon was slaughtered or driven away would be the most appropriate place for these rich merchants and nobles of Bite to socialize. Of course, this was all for later. At this moment, they were desperately evacuating from Lingang district, just like how they had done before. But not everyone was leaving. For example, the big-bellied general and some other military nobles of Medic led various troops of the Praetorian Corps to the anchorage of Lingang district. If Keyes were here, he would be able to recognize some of his acquaintances. They had fought against the Japanese invasion together. Everyone, the big-bellied general greeted the other commanders. Because the young Blue Dragon had retreated and fought at the same time, they still had some time to prepare in advance. The sailors in this port have been gathered. We must immediately urge them to sail as far as possible to the open sea. The so-called open sea was the area outside the fjord near Lingang district. The waters there were open and ships could be seen. Whether sailing slowly to the deep sea or hiding behind the headland facing the fjord, it was a good way to avoid the aftermath of the upcoming battle. At this moment, if one more ship could sail out, it would save the trade of Bite City. Who will be in charge of fighting against the demon? Some other commanders of the Praetorian Corps questioned. Glancing at the Ogre brothers who were building equipment near the anchorage and the team of mercenaries from other planes they had brought, the big-bellied general explained helplessly, "Naval warfare is not the strength of the Praetorian Corps. We lack professional tools to deal with the demon." The big-bellied general spent a lot of effort and even used physical persuasion on some of his old subordinates. Soon, he passed his order to the Praetorian Corps to carry it out. As for himself, he pretended to be nonchalant and slowly walked towards the location of the Ogre brothers. The Medicic veteran was very curious about those professional weapons from the bottom of his heart. Chapter 305. What are you guys preparing? The big-bellied general approached the ogre who was hammering and asked in confusion, "Do you need me to deploy some capable lads to help? After all, there are only a few dozen of you, and it doesn't look like enough manpower." Out of curiosity about the Demon Slayer weapon, the military aristocrat of Medici did not hesitate to approach and talk to Neru. Unfortunately, Neru, who was engrossed in assembling his own independently designed weapon, did not understand his good intentions. There's no need for that. The ogre commanded the two polar bear men to lift the bronze cannon barrel and help him install a threaded spare part. "You little people don't have enough strength, and the tools here are not enough." The big-bellied general's remaining words were stuck in his throat. He really could not refute Neru's reason. Without the help of heavy machinery, with only human strength, not to mention the bronze cannon barrel and other components, they could not even lift a random spare part on the ground easily. However, he still did not give up the idea of stealing, and the ogre, who was busy assembling the equipment, did not care at all. Neru, who aspired to become a weapon master, was a little happy that someone recognized his new weapon design. Of course, there was also a premise, and that was the other party did not get in the way and affect the progress of the work. After inserting the last fixed bronze cannon barrel into the rotating wheel, Nalu clapped his hands and tried the handle of the rotating wheel. "Bring some blubber here." The ogre, who had transformed into a weapon engineer, pointed to the hole reserved on the wheel and said to the two polar bear men beside him, "Pour some in, but don't overdo it. One person is responsible for filling the oil, and the other is responsible for rotating the wheel to feel the lubrication." After saying this, Nalu walked to another rotating machine and performed the same check and acceptance work. Not far from the bronze wheel machine, some camel shamans were using shaman spells to constantly summon the elements in the earth to form a slope at a fixed angle with the ground. The kobolds of the Dragonborn clan, who came from the terminal to support, stood on the slope and dug trenches with flat shovels. Then, some ceramic tubes were placed in them, and finally, a layer of lubricating grease was smeared in the tubes. Although these weapons were beyond the big-bellied general's knowledge, he could still roughly understand their function through observation. However, other than that, there were also some strangely shaped machines that he couldn't understand. For example, the few machines that Brew's brother, Ogre Brew, was in charge of personally training. It was triangular in shape, and its outer shell was made of hollow but sturdy bamboo. It was fastened with rivets and knots. Inside, there were many small metal structures with operating levers. Brew had purposely injected 2 different liquids into them. In the middle of the metal structure, there was a transmission rod that was connected to a special blade-shaped component on top of the machine. Next to the ogre's huge body, the machine seemed small. Even to the polar bear men and hunchbacks, these machines were like children's toys. Taking into account the length of the metal joysticks, the big-bellied general deduced that these machines would most likely be controlled by the desert kobolds. However, could it be that the desert kobold's battle prowess was comparable to the demon lord's incarnation? The big-bellied general couldn't figure it out. However, his incomprehension didn't reduce the efficiency of this strange team of polar bear men, hunchbacks, dragon-blessed kobolds, and ogres. They were like a sophisticated machine that was running in an orderly manner. When the figures of Quess and Hemtar appeared in the sky not far away, the machine was screwed on the last screw. Archers, get ready. The commanders of the Imperial Guard Legion, who had urged some ships to sail away from the fjords, still hoped that their troops could be of some use. Seize the commanding heights and shoot at will. The big-bellied general didn't stop them. In fact, he had already ordered his guards to search for several ballistas from other places. He personally adjusted the angle of the ballistas, intending to give the great demon, who was wreaking havoc in Bite City, a hard blow. As the young blue dragon had already communicated with the ogre brothers, the moment the young blue dragon approached the harbor anchorage of Lingang District, he immediately transformed back into his human form. In this form, he could avoid the indiscriminate saturation attacks as much as possible. The revolving cannons are in position. Target Zhuyuan. Angle of 30 degrees, south-southwest. It was hard to imagine that an ogre could calculate all the parameters so quickly. When it came to weapons, Nara was like a completely different person, completely different from the boorish man he used to be. Following his order, the polar bear men immediately turned the bronze revolving cannons, which were firmly fixed to the ground by pedestals with pincers attached to their feet. With the turntable with dial numbers and amazing strength, the polar bear men moved the barrels to the appropriate positions within 2 or 3 breaths at most. Fire! The gunpowder exploded in the barrels, and the sound of bang, bang, bang was incessant. Every time the revolving wheel turned, a shell shot out of the bronze barrels, tearing through the air and bombarding the target in the air. At this time, another polar bearman with earplugs was responsible for cleaning the barrels, filling them with gunpowder, and storing shells. Only a powerful species like the polar bear men could change the heavy steel core bullets with one hand. Relying on the artillery tactics learned from the 9 prisons of Bader and the bronze revolving cannons personally designed by Naru, the term firepower suppression was perfectly interpreted in the Ash world for the first time. The continuous bombardment was very powerful. In comparison, although the archers of the Royal Guard Army occupied the commanding heights, the sparse rain of arrows they shot was indeed a little shabby. Because he was too close to Hemtar, Keys awkwardly became the target of the bombardment. Fortunately, the young blue dragon had changed into a human form and somewhat unkindly hid behind the demon lord's incarnation, using it as his shield. After a round of bombardment, the half-human, half-worm Hemtar's body was covered with many black cracks. The cannonballs had caused some damage to his body, although it was not fatal. In pain, the great evil demon quickly lowered itself to the ground, hoping to avoid the next round of attacks and destroy the despicable artillery base at the same time. Whoosh! Seizing the opportunity, the big-bellied general, who had just been attacked by the ogre's bronze revolving cannons, decisively pulled the spring of the ballista. The bowstring gave the heavy ballista an amazing speed and fiercely pierced the tail of the demon lord's incarnation. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.